Children as young as 6 were running entire Wild West schools while their teachers disappeared for weeks. You think modern education is broken, but these leaderless classrooms somehow produced the generation that built America. How did complete chaos create better results than today's system? Picture a dusty frontier town in 1870. What's the first thing settlers built after their homes and general store? You might guess a saloon or bank, but you'd be wrong. They built a school. These weren't wealthy communities with money to burn. They were hard-scrabble pioneers who counted every penny. Yet somehow, education always made the list of absolute essentials. The race to establish schools across the Wild West wasn't just about teaching kids to read. It was about respect. A town without a school was just a collection of shacks in the middle of nowhere. A town with a school, that was a real community worth investing in, worth staying in, worth bragging about to relatives back east. This competitive spirit drove settlements to remarkable lengths. Towns barely 6 months old would pool their resources to hire a teacher before they'd even finished digging wells. The schoolhouse often went up while half the residents were still living in tents. Priorities seemed backward to outsiders, but frontier families understood something crucial. Education separated civilization from chaos. Word traveled fast about which towns took education seriously. Families with children would bypass perfectly good settlements if they lacked schools. Real estate values, sparse as they were, depended heavily on educational opportunities. A town's first school was like a magnet, drawing in settlers who might otherwise keep moving west. Then there's the fascinating matter of timing. Most frontier schools opened within 18 months of a town's founding. That's lightning speed when you consider these communities were simultaneously establishing law enforcement, postal services, and basic infrastructure. Yet education consistently jumped to the front of the line. The pressure was intense. Neighboring towns watched each other like hawks, comparing teacher qualifications and school building quality. Nobody wanted to be the settlement that couldn't attract families because they'd skimped on education. Town founders quickly learned that a reputation for poor schooling could kill a community's growth prospects within a single season. But why such urgency? Frontier parents had lived through enough hardship to recognize a harsh truth: their children's futures depended entirely on what they learned in these early years. There wouldn't be second chances or fancy academies waiting down the road. This school, whatever its limitations, represented their kids' only shot at something better. The economic calculation was surprisingly sophisticated for such rough communities. Business owners discovered that educated residents made better customers, partners, and neighbors. A town full of literate adults could handle more complex commerce, attract better businesses, and solve problems without outside help. The school wasn't just an expense, it was an investment in the town's survival. Competition between settlements could get downright fierce. Towns would poach teachers from rivals with promises of better pay or housing. They'd rush construction projects to open schools earlier than neighboring communities. Some places even exaggerated their educational offerings in newspaper advertisements designed to lure new residents. Let's not forget the pure practicality driving these decisions. Frontier life demanded problem-solving skills that went far beyond basic survival. Managing finances, reading contracts, understanding new agricultural techniques, corresponding with distant suppliers, these tasks required genuine education, not just common sense. The psychological impact was equally important. Parents who'd sacrificed everything to move west needed proof they'd made the right choice for their families. A functioning school provided that reassurance. It said their children wouldn't be worse off than kids who'd stayed in established eastern towns. Religious motivations also played a role, though perhaps not the way you'd expect. Many settlers believed education was a moral obligation, that denying children learning opportunities was nearly sinful. This conviction pushed even the most cash-strapped communities to find money for schools when they couldn't afford much else. The weird part is how quickly these improvised schools became sources of genuine pride. Towns that had thrown together one-room schoolhouses in desperate haste soon treated them like crown jewels. Visitors were invariably given tours of the local school, no matter how humble the facility might appear. Success bred more success. Communities with established schools found it easier to attract skilled tradesmen, doctors, and other professionals who wanted education available for their own families. The school became a recruiting tool that paid dividends for years. Speed mattered, because timing was everything in frontier development. Towns that hesitated often found themselves bypassed by railroads, forgotten by territorial governments, or simply abandoned as residents moved to better-equipped settlements. The school served as an anchor. giving families reasons to stay put during tough times. These weren't just buildings going up, they were statements of faith in the future. Every nail hammered into a schoolhouse wall declared that this community intended to last, to grow, and to raise children who'd surpass their parents' accomplishments. What happened after towns committed to building these schools? Well, that's where things got really interesting. The actual construction revealed just how creative and resourceful frontier communities could be when their children's futures were on the line. Towns could dream about having schools all they wanted, but somebody had to actually build the things. And here's where frontier communities showed their true grit. They rolled up their sleeves and did it themselves. Most schoolhouses were tiny, single-room affairs that looked more like oversized cabins than the grand educational institutions we picture today. We're talking about buildings that measured maybe 20 by 30 feet if you were lucky. That was it. One room to house every kid in town, from the littlest 5-year-old to the gangly teenagers who towered over their desks. The community members became the construction crew. Dad put down his plow, Uncle Joe left his shop, and neighbor Tom abandoned his fence repairs. They gathered on weekends with hammers, saws, and whatever building skills they'd picked up over the years. Some knew carpentry, others just knew which end of a nail to hit. But they made it work. Parents provided the materials because nobody else was going to do it. Families donated lumber from their own land, cutting down trees and hauling logs to the building site. Mom might contribute fabric scraps for window coverings. The blacksmith forged nails and hinges. Everyone pitched in something, even if it was just their time and sweat. Then came the furniture challenge. You couldn't exactly order desks from a catalog and expect them to arrive next Tuesday, so the community made their own. Wooden desks were hammered together from whatever lumber was left over from the building itself. These weren't fancy pieces with smooth edges and perfect joints. They were functional, sturdy, and built to survive years of carving initials and spilled ink. The chalkboards were homemade too. Some communities got creative and painted entire walls with a dark mixture that could hold chalk marks. Others found actual slate if they were near quarries or had connections to suppliers. But plenty of schools made do with wooden boards painted black or dark green. Did they work perfectly? Not really, but they worked well enough. Student families didn't just build the school and walk away. They helped maintain these buildings year after year. When the roof leaked, families showed up with tools and materials. When the door hinges broke, someone's dad fixed them. When winter winds blew out windows, the community replaced them together. The whole process was rough around the edges, but it had something special. These weren't buildings constructed by distant contractors who'd never see the kids inside. Every nail, every board, every desk represented someone's personal investment in their children's future. Parents literally built their kids' education from the ground up. Building materials varied wildly depending on what was available locally. Prairie communities used sod blocks because trees were scarce. Mountain towns had plenty of timber, but struggled to get glass for windows. Desert communities made do with adobe when they could get the clay. Each schoolhouse reflected the landscape and resources of its particular corner of the frontier. The construction quality was, let's be honest, pretty hit or miss. Some communities had skilled builders who created solid, lasting structures. Others had more enthusiasm than expertise, resulting in buildings that creaked in the wind and developed character gaps between the boards. But even the shakiest schoolhouse was better than no schoolhouse at all. Winter construction presented special challenges. Families worked around weather, trying to get roofs up before snow fell and walls sealed before the worst cold hit. Many school buildings went up in phases, with communities adding improvements year by year as time and resources allowed. The weird part is how much pride these simple buildings generated. Parents who'd hammered together basic wooden boxes talked about their schoolhouse like it was the finest educational institution in the country, and maybe in their corner of the frontier, it actually was. Tools were shared freely during construction. The same saw might build 3 different families' contributions to the project. Hammers, levels, and measuring tools passed from hand to hand. This sharing made the building process possible, but also turned construction into a community bonding experience. Some schoolhouses doubled as meeting halls, churches, or social centers when classes weren't in session. This multi-purpose design made the building investment more practical for cash-strapped communities. The same desks that held spelling lessons on Tuesday might support a town meeting on Wednesday night. Quality control was whatever the community decided was good enough. No inspectors showed up with clipboards and regulations. If the building kept the weather out and provided space for learning, it passed the test. Standards were practical rather than perfect. These homemade schoolhouses created something unexpected, buildings that perfectly matched their community's needs, resources, and personalities. Each one was unique because each was built by different hands with different materials and different challenges. But where exactly did communities decide to put these precious educational investments? Location would prove just as important as construction. Building a school was one thing, but figuring out where to put it, that decision could make or break a frontier community's entire educational future. Towns couldn't just plop a schoolhouse anywhere and hope for the best. Most settlements aimed for the sweet spot, right smack in the center of town. Makes sense, right? If you wanted every family to have a fighting chance at getting their kids to school, you had to think about walking distance. Little Jimmy might be tough enough to wrangle cattle, but asking him to hike 5 miles through mud and snow just to learn his ABCs was pushing it. But here's where things got tricky. The center of town in 1870s Wyoming wasn't exactly Times Square. We're talking about a handful of buildings, a dirt road, and maybe a general store, if the town was lucky. Sometimes the geographical center meant placing the school next to the saloon or the blacksmith shop. Parents had to weigh their options carefully. Then there was the daily reality of getting kids to school. No yellow buses rolling up to farmhouse doors, no parent drop-off lanes. Children walked, rode horses, or if they were really fortunate, caught a ride in a wagon. The schoolhouse location had to account for creek crossings, rocky terrain, and the occasional wolf pack that might wander through the area. Distance wasn't the only concern. Safety mattered too. A school positioned too far from the main settlement left children vulnerable during emergencies. Wild weather could strike without warning, and having the schoolhouse within shouting distance of other buildings meant help was available when things went sideways. Weather played a huge role in location decisions. Smart communities avoided low-lying areas that turned into swamps during spring thaw. Nobody wanted their kids sloshing through knee-deep mud just to get to arithmetic lessons. Higher ground was preferred, but not so high that winter winds would blow the roof clean off. Water access was another crucial factor. Schools needed wells or nearby streams for drinking water and basic sanitation, but not too close. Flooding could shut down education for weeks. Finding that perfect balance between convenience and safety required genuine frontier wisdom. Let's not forget the practical space requirements. Every schoolhouse needed a decent-sized yard, usually about half an acre of open space. This wasn't for fancy playground equipment, there wasn't any. Kids needed room to run around during recess, play simple games, and burn off energy before sitting still for hours of lessons. The yard also served as an outdoor classroom when weather permitted. The schoolyard typically included some essential outbuildings. Privies stood at a respectful distance from the main building. Nobody wanted unpleasant odors drifting through open windows during geography lessons. Horse sheds were equally important since many students rode to school. These sheds protected animals from harsh weather, while kids were inside learning. Some communities got creative with dual-purpose locations. A few schools doubled as community meeting halls, which meant positioning them where adults could easily gather for town business. Sunday church services sometimes took place in the same building, adding another layer to location considerations. Transportation routes influenced school placement more than people might expect. As railroads expanded westward, towns wanted their schools visible from train windows. Passing travelers would see children at their lessons and think, now there's a civilized community worth stopping in. Schools became advertising for the entire settlement. Then there were the unexpected challenges. Prairie fires could sweep through an area in minutes, so schools needed clear sightlines and escape routes. Flash floods might turn a gentle creek into a raging torrent. Even harmless-looking hills could hide dangerous animals or provide cover for less friendly human visitors. Property ownership complicated matters too. Towns had to negotiate with landowners, and not everyone was eager to sell their best plots for a school. Sometimes communities ended up with less than ideal locations, simply because that's what they could afford. The weird part is how many schools ended up becoming the actual center of their communities over time. Towns would grow around their schoolhouses rather than the other way around. Families wanted to live close to education, so new homes and businesses sprouted nearby. What started as a remote school location gradually became Main Street. Weather patterns unique to each region created additional headaches. Desert communities worried about sandstorms and extreme heat. Mountain towns dealt with avalanche risks and snow that could bury buildings for months. Coastal areas faced different challenges entirely. Each environment demanded specific location strategies, but choosing the right spot was just the beginning of making frontier education work. Once communities figured out where to build their schools, they faced an even bigger challenge: finding someone brave enough to actually teach there. The story of frontier teachers reveals just how tough life could get when you were the only adult responsible for educating an entire community's children. Building schools was just the first challenge these frontier communities faced. Finding someone to actually run them, that was a whole different story entirely. Picture walking into a one-room schoolhouse and seeing 15 kids ranging from 5-year-old farm boys to 18-year-old ranch hands. Now imagine being the only adult responsible for teaching them all. Reading to the little ones while helping teenagers with advanced arithmetic. Managing discipline when some of your students are nearly as tall as you are. Welcome to the daily reality of the frontier teacher. Most of these educational heroes were young women, often barely out of their teens themselves. Why women? Well, communities discovered that hiring female teachers cost about half what they'd pay a man. Makes sense from a budget standpoint, right? But there was more to it than simple economics. Women were considered naturally better with children, more patient and less likely to abandon the job for gold prospecting adventures. The pay was absolutely terrible by any standard. A typical teacher might earn $35 to $40 per month when the school was in session. But here's the thing about frontier economics. Sometimes there wasn't even cash involved. Many teachers received room and board as partial payment, living with different families throughout the school year. One month they'd stay with the blacksmith's family, the next with the general store owner. Talk about never really having your own space. Then there's the matter of qualifications. Forget teaching degrees or years of specialized training. Most frontier teachers had completed 8th grade themselves, maybe attended a few months at a normal school if they were lucky. The hiring process was refreshingly simple. Could you read, write, and handle basic arithmetic? Could you maintain order in a classroom? Congratulations, you're hired. But don't think these women were unprepared for the challenge. Many possessed an iron will that would make a cavalry sergeant proud. They had to. Managing students who ranged from barely literate 5-year-olds to teenage boys who could rope cattle and fix wagon wheels required serious backbone. Some students were older and stronger than their teachers, creating interesting dynamics when discipline became necessary. The workload was absolutely crushing. These teachers planned lessons for multiple grade levels simultaneously. While the youngest children practiced letter recognition, older students worked on geography or history recitation. The teacher might spend 5 minutes helping a 7-year-old with basic reading, then immediately switch to explaining fractions to the 10-year-olds, followed by reviewing Shakespeare with the teenagers, all happening in the same room, at the same time. Community expectations added another layer of pressure. Teachers were expected to be moral exemplars, attending church regularly and maintaining impeccable behavior. Many teaching contracts included clauses prohibiting marriage, the assumption being that married women should focus on their own families. Getting caught drinking, dancing, or keeping company with men could result in immediate termination. The social restrictions were suffocating, especially for young women far from their own families. And the weird part is, despite these harsh conditions, many teachers genuinely loved the work. They formed deep connections with their students, and took pride in watching children master reading, or successfully complete difficult arithmetic problems. Some teachers stayed in the same community for years, becoming beloved figures who shaped multiple generations. Winter presented special challenges. Teachers often arrived at freezing schoolhouses before dawn to start fires in the pot-bellied stoves. They'd chop kindling, haul water, and sweep floors before students arrived. During blizzards, some teachers stayed overnight in the schoolhouse rather than risk the journey home. Imagine spending a night alone in a drafty building, with only a wood stove for warmth, preparing lessons by lamplight. The isolation could be overwhelming. Many teachers came from back east, leaving family and friends behind for frontier opportunities. Letters took weeks to arrive, and social opportunities were limited in small towns. Some teachers battled serious loneliness, especially during long winter months when travel became nearly impossible. But here's what made these women remarkable. They adapted and persevered. They created innovative teaching methods, developed creative ways to manage multi-age classrooms, and often became the cultural heart of their communities. Many teachers organized spelling bees, recitation contests, and holiday programs that brought entire towns together. The turnover rate was predictably high. Some teachers lasted only a few months before the challenges became too much. Others met local men and married, ending their teaching careers according to community expectations. But the ones who stayed often became legends, remembered fondly by students decades later. The success of these lone teachers directly shaped how effectively children learned in frontier schools. Their ability to juggle multiple ages and subjects determined whether students mastered basic skills or struggled with gaps in their education. However, having one teacher handle everything was just part of the unique educational puzzle these communities created. The way they actually organized all those different ages and abilities in one room created its own fascinating challenges and surprising solutions. Walking into a Wild West schoolhouse was like stepping into organized chaos. A 7-year-old sat next to a 16-year-old, both sharing the same wooden bench, both supposedly getting an education tailored to their needs. The teacher somehow had to make this madness work. Most one-room schools packed kids from ages 5 to 18 into a single space. The little ones barely knew their letters, while the older students wrestled with advanced arithmetic and geography. Yet this mixing of ages wasn't seen as a problem. It was actually considered brilliant by many educators of the time. The secret weapon, peer teaching. Older students naturally became assistant teachers, helping younger kids with their lessons while reinforcing their own learning. A 14-year-old who struggled with long division suddenly understood it perfectly when explaining it to an 8. Makes sense, right? Teachers divided their classrooms into invisible sections based on ability, rather than strict age groups. The primers sat up front. These were the youngest students just learning to read. Behind them came the intermediate group, usually ages 8 to 12, working on basic arithmetic and simple geography. The back rows held the advanced students, typically teenagers, who could handle complex problems and help maintain order. But here's where it gets interesting. A particularly bright 10-year-old might find herself working with the advanced group in reading while staying with her age peers for arithmetic. Meanwhile, a slow-learning 15-year-old might drop back to work on basic skills without the shame that would come in today's grade-specific system. The daily routine resembled a carefully choreographed dance. While the teacher worked directly with one group, the others were expected to study quietly, complete assignments, or help younger students. Dead silence wasn't expected. Low murmurs of older kids coaching younger ones were perfectly acceptable. Recitation played a huge role in this multi-level system. Students would stand and recite their lessons aloud, whether it was multiplication tables, poetry, or historical facts. This wasn't just showing off, it was practical. When a 12-year-old recited the states and capitals, the younger kids absorbed the information through repetition. The older students reinforced their knowledge by listening and sometimes correcting mistakes. Then there's the matter of individualized learning, though they didn't call it that back then. Each student progressed at their own pace through readers and arithmetic books. A quick learner might zip through 3 grade levels in a year, while someone struggling with reading might take 2 years to master what others learned in 1. Nobody got left behind simply because of their age. The mixing created some unexpected benefits. Younger children looked up to older students as role models, learning not just academic subjects but social skills and behavior. Older kids developed patience, leadership abilities, and a deeper understanding of subjects through teaching. A natural mentorship system emerged that modern educators spend fortunes trying to recreate. Well, not everything was perfect in this educational paradise. Discipline challenges multiplied when you had teenagers and toddlers in the same space. A 17-year-old boy who'd rather be working his family's ranch didn't always appreciate being stuck next to chattering 6-year-olds. Fights between different age groups required careful handling from teachers who often weren't much older than their oldest students. Supplies presented another headache. One arithmetic book might serve students ranging from basic addition to complex fractions. Teachers had to create multiple lessons from the same materials, challenging advanced students while not overwhelming beginners. Creativity became essential when your textbook supply consisted of whatever the community could scrape together. The weird part is how well this system actually worked for many students. Without the pressure of grade-level expectations, kids learned at their natural pace. Some discovered they were brilliant in certain subjects while needing extra help in others. The mixed-age environment more closely resembled real life than our current age-segregated classrooms. Parents appreciated the practical benefits too. Families with multiple school-age children could send them all to the same place, knowing older siblings would watch out for younger ones during the walk to and from school. Brothers and sisters helped each other with homework, creating educational partnerships that extended beyond the schoolhouse walls. Academic competitions took on interesting dimensions when ages mixed freely. Spelling bees might pit a sharp 11-year-old against a struggling 16-year-old, with victory going to knowledge and preparation rather than age. These contests drew whole communities together, with everyone cheering for their neighbors' children regardless of how old they were. The multi-level classroom forced teachers to become educational magicians, juggling different lessons, managing various ability levels, and maintaining order among students who might differ in age by more than a decade. Not every teacher succeeded, but those who mastered the system created learning environments that modern educators still study and admire. But while these mixed-age classrooms hummed with activity, they couldn't function without something equally important: the community's complete involvement in making education work. Let's not forget that schools needed more than just teachers and students to survive. Building a frontier schoolhouse was just the beginning. The real magic happened when parents rolled up their sleeves and made education their personal mission. These weren't distant school boards or faceless administrators making decisions from marble offices downtown. Nope, every single family had skin in the game. Picture this: October mornings when frost started biting at wooden window frames, and someone had to keep that classroom warm. Who do you think chopped the wood? Dad grabbed his axe before dawn broke, splitting logs behind the schoolhouse while his breath made little clouds in the cold air. Mom packed extra mittens for the teacher, knowing full well that keeping 30 kids warm took more than good intentions. Then there's the matter of keeping everything running smoothly. Broken desks didn't magically fix themselves. When little Tommy carved his initials too deep into the wood, his father showed up Saturday morning with tools and a stern lecture about respect for community property. Mothers took turns scrubbing floors, washing windows and patching holes where winter wind tried to sneak through, but the involvement ran much deeper than manual labor. Town meetings buzzed with heated debates about school policies. Should they allow dancing lessons? What about teaching German to the immigrant children? These weren't casual conversations over coffee. Families argued passionately because they knew their decisions shaped their children's futures. The hiring process was particularly intense. When word spread that the current teacher was moving on, the whole community transformed into a panel of job interviewers. They grilled candidates about everything from penmanship to moral character. Mrs. Henderson might ask about arithmetic methods while Mr. Johnson tested the applicant's knowledge of history. Everyone had opinions, and everyone voiced them loudly. Firing teachers was equally dramatic. Sometimes a young teacher would clash with local values or prove too lenient with discipline. The community didn't wait for bureaucratic processes. They simply called a meeting, voted, and sent the teacher packing on the next stagecoach. Harsh? Maybe. But when your own children's education hung in the balance, pleasantries took a back seat to results. School events became the heartbeat of frontier social life. Christmas pageants drew every soul within riding distance. Parents who barely spoke to each other during regular times suddenly collaborated on costumes and decorations. The annual spelling bee was serious business. Families coached their kids like prize-fighters preparing for championship bouts. Community members donated whatever they could spare. The blacksmith forged new hinges when doors sagged. The town's best seamstress mended torn curtains. Farmers brought fresh produce for school lunches, and ranchers supplied milk when their cows were producing extra. Everyone contributed something, even if it was just enthusiasm and elbow grease. Well, let's not forget the politics that simmered beneath all this cooperation. Different families had different ideas about what constituted proper education. The Methodist minister's wife wanted more Bible study. The former Boston lawyer insisted on Latin lessons. The practical ranchers pushed for skills that actually helped with frontier survival. These disagreements sometimes exploded into full-blown feuds. Families stopped speaking to each other over curriculum choices. Some parents threatened to start their own schools if things didn't go their way. The drama rivaled anything happening in the saloons, except it centered on whether children should learn poetry or spend more time on practical mathematics. And the weird part is how quickly communities could mobilize when crisis struck. When scarlet fever threatened to close the school, parents organized quarantine procedures and home instruction schedules within hours. If the roof leaked during spring rains, a repair crew materialized before the puddles dried. External threats transformed petty squabbles into unified action faster than anyone thought possible. The teacher's living situation perfectly illustrated this community ownership. Many teachers boarded with different families throughout the year, rotating monthly to spread the burden and expense. This arrangement meant everyone got to observe the teacher's character up close. Privacy was non-existent, but support was constant. Financial responsibility was shared too. When the territory couldn't provide adequate funding, communities passed the hat. Wealthy families contributed more, but even the poorest settlers offered what they could. Some paid in goods rather than cash. Chickens, vegetables, or manual labor counted as legitimate contributions. School discipline policies required community consensus. Parents debated the appropriate level of corporal punishment, established rules about tardiness, and decided consequences for serious misbehavior. Children knew that school rules had their parents' full backing, making rebellion feel pretty pointless. This deep involvement created something remarkable: schools that truly reflected their community's values and priorities. The education wasn't standardized or sanitized by distant authorities. It was raw, immediate, and intensely personal. But all this community control came with significant drawbacks that would soon become impossible to ignore. While parents chopped wood and maintained schoolhouses, teachers faced the enormous challenge of actually educating dozens of students across multiple age groups. What exactly were these frontier children supposed to learn? The curriculum was surprisingly straightforward, though the methods might shock modern parents. Reading, writing, and arithmetic formed the holy trinity of frontier education. Teachers called them the 3 R's, and everything else was considered luxury. These basics weren't just subjects, they were survival tools in a world where signing your name meant the difference between owning land and getting cheated out of it. Reading lessons began with the alphabet, but not in any gentle picture book way. Children learned letters through relentless drilling. A stands for apple, B stands for boy, C stands for cat, over and over until the letters burned into their memories like cattle brands. Teachers believed repetition was the mother of learning, and they weren't taking any chances. Then came the memorization marathons. Students memorized entire poems, Bible verses, and chunks of famous speeches. Why? Because books were scarce, and human memory was the most reliable storage device available. A child who could recite 50 poems had 50 poems forever, regardless of whether the schoolhouse burned down or the family moved to the next territory. Recitation contests turned memorization into sport. Students stood before the entire class, hands clasped behind their backs, rattling off the Gettysburg Address or Paul Revere's Ride without missing a syllable. Teachers judged harshly. One forgotten word meant sitting down in shame. These contests weren't just academic exercises. They prepared children for a world where public speaking could make or break business deals, court cases, and political careers. Writing instruction focused obsessively on penmanship. Teachers examined every loop, slant, and curve with microscopic attention. Poor handwriting wasn't just embarrassing, it was practically a character flaw. Letters had to be perfectly formed, evenly spaced, and consistently slanted. Students spent hours practicing the Palmer method, creating endless rows of circles and slashes until their hands cramped. But why such fanatical attention to handwriting? In an age before typewriters became common, your penmanship was your professional calling card. Sloppy writing suggested a sloppy mind, and employers judged job applicants partly on how their letters looked. A beautifully written application could open doors that remained closed to brilliant minds with chicken-scratch handwriting. Arithmetic lessons were brutally practical. Students learned addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division not through abstract problems but through real-world scenarios. How many bushels of wheat fit in the wagon? What's the total cost of 15 yards of fabric at 37 cents per yard? If the train travels 45 miles per hour, when will it reach Denver? These math problems weren't random. They reflected the economic realities of frontier life. Children needed to calculate lumber costs, figure out livestock feed requirements, and determine fair prices at markets where cheating was common. A kid who couldn't do quick mental math might grow up losing money in every business transaction. Let's not forget the role of religion in frontier curricula. Many schools included Bible readings, though this varied dramatically by community. Some teachers opened each day with scripture and prayer, others stuck to secular subjects, especially in towns with diverse religious populations. The Bible served double duty as both spiritual instruction and reading practice. After all, it was often the only book guaranteed to be available. Geography lessons relied heavily on whatever maps teachers could find. Students memorized state capitals, major rivers, and mountain ranges. But frontier geography instruction had a practical twist. Children learned about places they might actually visit or move to. Which routes led to California? Where were the best farming territories? What cities offered the most opportunities? The weird part is how teachers managed to teach multiple subjects to multiple age groups simultaneously. A typical morning might see 5-year-olds practicing their ABCs in one corner, while 12-year-olds worked multiplication problems, and 15-year-olds passed complex sentences. Teachers rotated between groups like spinning plates, checking progress, and assigning new tasks. Older students often became unofficial teaching assistants. A 14-year-old who had mastered long division might drill arithmetic tables with younger children while the teacher worked with another group. This peer teaching system wasn't just practical, it reinforced learning for the older students and created a sense of community responsibility. Testing was informal but constant. Teachers questioned students randomly throughout the day, checking their retention of previous lessons. Surprise recitations kept everyone alert. No child knew when they might be called upon to demonstrate their knowledge, so staying prepared was essential. These curriculum basics might seem limited compared to modern education, but they produced remarkably literate populations in frontier communities. Children who mastered reading, writing, and arithmetic had the foundation for lifelong learning. But what happened when books and supplies ran short? The creative solutions teachers developed for scarce materials would test their ingenuity in ways that shaped entire generations of Western students. Books cost serious money back then. A single textbook could eat up a family's grocery budget for weeks. Families with 4 or 5 kids attending the one-room schoolhouse. They'd be looking at choosing between feeding everyone properly or buying enough books for school. Most chose food, which meant creative solutions had to emerge fast. Enter the sharing system that defined frontier education. 3 kids would crowd around one battered copy of Webster's Blueback Speller, heads bumped together, trying to memorize the same page. The teacher would assign reading time slots. Mary gets the arithmetic book from 9 to 10, then passes it to James, then to Sarah. By afternoon, that same book might have traveled through 8 different hands, each student frantically scribbling notes before their turn ended. McGuffey readers became the undisputed kings of the schoolhouse. William Holmes McGuffey created these reading books that taught morals alongside literacy. Every frontier kid knew the stories by heart. Frank was a good boy, and the honest boy weren't just reading exercises. They hammered home values while building vocabulary. Towns that managed to scrape together money for books almost always bought McGuffey readers first. Smart choice, really. One set could last decades if handled carefully. But here's where things got interesting. Paper was expensive and hard to transport across long distances. Solution: slate boards and chalk became the primary writing tools for most students. Kids would practice their letters, work math problems, and write short stories on these dark grey rectangles. When finished, a quick swipe with a rag erased everything, ready for the next lesson. The constant scratch of chalk on slate created the background soundtrack of every frontier classroom. Some schools couldn't even afford individual slate boards. Students would line up to use the one large blackboard at the front of the room. The teacher might write a math problem, and kids would take turns solving it while others watched. Peer pressure worked wonders for motivation. Nobody wanted to embarrass themselves in front of the whole mixed-age classroom. Then there were the schools that operated on pure desperation. Books? What books? These teachers worked with whatever reading material families could contribute. Old newspapers became geography lessons when they contained stories from distant cities. Family Bibles doubled as literature class. Almanacs taught math through weather statistics and farming calculations. One Nevada schoolhouse reportedly used nothing but catalog pages from Sears Roebuck for an entire winter. Students learned to read by studying descriptions of farm equipment and ladies' corsets. Ink presented another challenge entirely. Store-bought ink was luxury stuff in many frontier towns. Teachers mixed their own using soot, berries, or even crushed insects. The resulting concoctions ranged from deep black to muddy brown to questionable purple. Sometimes the homemade ink would freeze solid during winter months. Students would warm their bottles near the pot-bellied stove, hoping the liquid wouldn't evaporate completely before writing time. Pencils were precious commodities too. A single pencil might serve an entire family's school needs for months. Kids learned to whittle them down to tiny nubs, squeezing every possible mark from the graphite. Some schools kept communal pencil collections, maybe 6 or 7 pencils shared among 25 students. Writing assignments became carefully planned events rather than casual daily activities. Maps and charts represented major investments for any schoolhouse. A good wall map of the United States might cost more than a month's worth of food supplies. Geography lessons often relied on hand-drawn sketches by the teacher. Students learned state locations by copying rough outlines onto their slate boards. The lucky schools that owned actual printed maps treated them like sacred artifacts, rolling them carefully after each use and storing them away from curious fingers. Arithmetic books proved especially challenging to share because math required so much practice. Teachers developed ingenious workarounds. They'd write problems on the blackboard and have students copy them onto slates. Or they'd create verbal math challenges, turning the entire classroom into a human calculator as students solved problems out loud together. Seasonal supply shortages made everything worse. Winter months often cut off supply deliveries completely. Spring floods could destroy precious book shipments before they reached remote schoolhouses. Teachers learned to hoard supplies like military quartermasters, rationing chalk pieces and guarding the few books with fierce determination. Some of the most resourceful teachers created their own textbooks. They'd write out lessons by hand, copying important passages from borrowed books before returning them to neighboring schools. These handmade textbooks got passed down from teacher to teacher, accumulating notes and corrections in the margins over years of use. The weird part is how well this system actually worked. Students learned to pay attention because they couldn't count on having their own copy to reference later. Memory skills developed out of pure necessity. When your turn with the spelling book lasted only 30 minutes, you'd better absorb every word on those pages. But even the most creative supply solutions couldn't solve every educational challenge these frontier schools faced. Because keeping order in a classroom where resources were scarce and students ranged from 5 to 18 years old, that required a completely different set of skills that would make or break any teacher's career. Building a schoolhouse was just the beginning. Making sure it actually functioned meant keeping 30 kids from turning the place into chaos. Enter the iron fist of frontier education. Discipline that would make today's parents call the authorities. Teachers wielded absolute power in their one-room kingdoms. No principals to consult. No counselors to handle problems. When little Johnny decided to pull Mary's braids or Tommy thought spitballs were funny, the teacher handled it solo. And by handled it, we mean with methods that would shock modern sensibilities. The hickory stick ruled supreme. Every teacher kept one within arm's reach, and every student knew exactly what it meant. Misbehave. And you'd find yourself bent over the teacher's desk getting acquainted with that piece of wood real quick. The sound of it connecting with a student's backside served as a warning to everyone else. 3 strikes was generous in most schools. Some teachers operated on a 1-strike policy, but physical punishment wasn't the only weapon in a teacher's arsenal. Public shaming worked wonders on kids who cared about their reputation. The dunce cap wasn't just a cartoon joke, it was a real humiliation device. Students who couldn't answer questions or broke rules found themselves wearing pointed hats while sitting in corners, facing the wall for hours. Their classmates got the message loud and clear. Then there were the more creative punishments that teachers invented on the spot. Kids might find themselves holding heavy books above their heads until their arms shook. Others got sentenced to write "I will not talk in class" 500 times on their slates. Some unfortunate souls had to stand on one foot for an hour while balancing a book on their head. The public nature of these punishments made them doubly effective. Nobody wanted to be the day's entertainment. School rules weren't suggestions. They were carved in stone commandments posted prominently where every student could see them. No talking without permission. Sit up straight at all times. Keep hands folded when not writing. No fidgeting. These weren't guidelines for a pleasant learning environment. They were survival instructions for making it through the day without punishment. Teachers maintained order through fear, plain and simple. Students learned quickly that stepping out of line meant immediate consequences. No warnings, no second chances, no calling parents for a conference. The teacher's word was law, and that law was enforced swiftly and publicly. The weird part is how effective this system actually was. With kids ranging from 5 to 18 crammed into one room, maintaining order seemed impossible. Yet somehow, teachers managed to keep 30 different personalities in line simultaneously. The threat of punishment hung over everything like a dark cloud. But it worked. Rewards were practically non-existent. Good behavior was expected, not celebrated. Excellent work might earn a brief nod of approval, but don't expect gold stars or special recognition. Students learned for learning's sake, not for praise or prizes. The absence of punishment was reward enough. Some teachers developed reputations that preceded them into every new classroom. Stories of particularly strict disciplinarians spread through communities like wildfire. Parents would warn their children about Mrs. Henderson's legendary temper or Mr. Wilson's lightning-fast reflexes with the hickory stick. These legends served as deterrents before kids even stepped foot in the schoolhouse. Let's not forget that teachers were often barely older than their oldest students. A 20-year-old teacher might be trying to control an 18-year-old farmhand who towered over her. Establishing authority required dramatic measures from day one. Show any weakness, and the classroom would descend into total chaos. The community fully supported these harsh methods. Parents expected teachers to maintain discipline by any means necessary. If a child came home complaining about punishment, they often received more of the same from their parents. "What did you do to deserve it?" was the typical response, not "How dare that teacher hurt my precious child." Physical punishment wasn't just accepted, it was demanded. Parents who sent their children to school expected them to learn respect for authority along with their letters and numbers. A soft teacher who couldn't maintain order would find themselves unemployed faster than they could say, "Please sit down." The psychological impact of this system shaped entire generations. Students learned to follow rules without question, respect authority figures, and understand that actions had immediate consequences. Whether this was beneficial or damaging depends on your perspective, but it certainly created a specific type of citizen. These disciplinary methods created an environment where learning could actually happen despite impossible circumstances. With so many ages and abilities in one room, chaos would have been the natural result without strict control. But even the most disciplined classroom couldn't force students to show up consistently. When harvest season arrived, or family emergencies struck, all the rules and punishments in the world couldn't keep kids in their seats. Education took a back seat when survival demanded attention. Frontier families couldn't always afford the luxury of sending their children to school every single day, while town leaders proudly built their one-room schoolhouses and hired dedicated teachers. Keeping kids in those wooden desks proved nearly impossible during certain times of the year. Harvest season turned schools into ghost towns practically overnight. When crops ripened in the fields, every able-bodied person became essential labor. Boys as young as 8 found themselves working alongside grown men, hauling wheat, corn, and barley from dawn until dusk. Their small hands could pick cotton faster than adults in some cases. Families needed every penny they could earn, and an extra worker, even a child, meant the difference between prosperity and poverty. But the attendance problems went far deeper than just autumn harvests. Spring planting season pulled kids away from their lessons too. Ranch work never stopped, and cattle didn't care about arithmetic lessons. Boys learned to rope and brand cattle instead of practicing penmanship. They herded sheep across vast plains while their empty school desks gathered dust. Girls faced their own attendance challenges at home. When mothers fell ill during childbirth or harsh winters, older daughters stepped in to manage entire households. These young girls cooked meals for large families, tended to sick relatives, and cared for babies. A 10-year-old girl might find herself responsible for feeding 6 younger siblings while her mother recovered from illness. School seemed like an impossible luxury under those circumstances. Weather created another massive barrier to regular attendance. Blizzards could trap families for weeks at a time. When snow piled higher than horse saddles, reaching the schoolhouse became genuinely dangerous. Some children lived 5 or 6 miles from school, and traveling that distance in freezing temperatures risked frostbite or worse. Teachers often found themselves alone in empty classrooms, keeping the fire burning for nobody. Then there were families who never intended to send their children to school at all. Some parents believed book learning was useless for frontier life. Why waste time on poetry when you needed to know how to shoe a horse? These families kept their children home year-round, teaching them practical skills instead. Boys learned carpentry, blacksmithing, and animal husbandry from their fathers. Girls mastered cooking, sewing, and household management alongside their mothers. The weird part is that some of these families were probably right. Many frontier children who never set foot in a classroom still became successful ranchers, store owners, and skilled craftsmen. They learned through hands-on experience rather than textbooks. Their education came from real-world challenges that no schoolhouse could replicate. Distance played a huge role in attendance problems too. Families scattered across remote areas sometimes lived 20 miles or more from the nearest school. Parents couldn't justify sending young children on such dangerous journeys daily. Wild animals, rough terrain, and unpredictable weather made these trips genuinely risky. Some families tried boarding their children in town during school months, but most couldn't afford the extra expense. Economic pressures forced many children into work at incredibly young ages. Mining families needed extra income so desperately that children as young as 7 worked in dangerous conditions. They sorted coal, carried tools, and performed other tasks that kept them away from education entirely. Factory work in larger frontier towns also pulled children away from classrooms. A child's wages might pay for the family's entire food supply for a week. Teachers quickly learned to expect these attendance patterns, but it made their jobs nearly impossible. How do you maintain consistent lessons when half your students disappear for months at a time? Some teachers gave up trying to follow structured curricula, Instead, they focused on whatever students happened to show up on any given day. Well, the most dedicated teachers found creative solutions. They visited students at their homes when possible, bringing lessons directly to children who couldn't attend regularly. Some teachers worked with families to create flexible schedules, allowing children to attend school during slower work periods. A few teachers even helped with harvest work themselves, earning community respect and better cooperation with attendants. Community attitudes toward education varied wildly from place to place. Some towns valued schooling highly and found ways to work around attendance challenges. Others treated school as a nice luxury that came second to more pressing needs. These different attitudes created drastically different educational outcomes for frontier children. The unpredictable nature of frontier school attendance created lasting effects on entire generations. Children who missed large chunks of their education often struggled to catch up later, but it also produced remarkably self-reliant individuals who could adapt to almost any situation. Despite all these challenges, something interesting was happening behind the scenes. Communities were slowly recognizing that education gaps created long-term problems. The question was what could be done when entire groups of children were systematically excluded from educational opportunities. While some children walked freely through schoolhouse doors, others found those same doors slammed shut in their faces. The promise of education for all wasn't exactly what it seemed in Wild West communities. Race, ethnicity, and color determined whether a child could sit at those wooden desks or if they'd have to find another way to learn their letters. Most Western towns passed laws that flat-out banned minority children from attending white schools. These weren't suggestions or guidelines, they were hard rules backed by local governments. Chinese families, who had come west to work on railroads and in mines, watched their children get turned away from public schools. Hispanic families, many of whom had lived on the land long before it became American territory, faced the same rejection. The irony, some of these families had been there longer than the very people excluding them. But here's where things get interesting. Rather than accept defeat, these communities did something remarkable. They built their own schools. Chinese immigrants pooled their resources to hire teachers who could speak both English and Chinese. They understood that education was the key to their children's future success, even if the broader community didn't want them included. These schools often operated in the back rooms of shops or in converted buildings, hidden from the main streets, but buzzing with determined young minds. Hispanic communities followed a similar path. They established escuelas where children learned in both Spanish and English, preserving their cultural heritage while preparing for life in an English-speaking society. These weren't inferior alternatives. Often they provided more personalized attention and stronger community support than the official public schools. Then there's the tragic story of Native American children, which takes a much darker turn. Instead of being allowed to attend local schools or even establish their own, many Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to distant boarding schools. The government's goal was clear and disturbing: eliminate Native culture entirely. Children as young as 5 were taken hundreds of miles from home, forbidden to speak their native languages, and punished for practicing any tribal customs. These boarding schools operated under the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Students had their hair cut short, were given English names, and were dressed in military-style uniforms. Letters home were censored or banned entirely. Many children didn't see their families for years. The emotional and cultural damage was devastating and lasted for generations. Meanwhile, back in Western towns, segregation wasn't just about schools, it shaped entire communities. Some towns had unofficial but strictly enforced boundaries. Minority families lived in certain neighborhoods, shopped at specific stores, and their children attended separate schools. The white schoolhouse might sit prominently on Main Street, while the colored school was tucked away on the outskirts of town, often in a building that was older, smaller, and poorly maintained. The quality gap was huge. White schools received better funding, newer textbooks, and more qualified teachers. Segregated schools made do with hand-me-down books, often missing pages or completely outdated. Teachers in these schools frequently worked for half the salary of their counterparts in white schools, yet they carried the same heavy workload of managing multiple grades in one room. Access varied wildly from place to place, creating a confusing patchwork of rules. One town might allow Mexican-American children in their schools while banning Chinese students. Another might accept anyone who could pay a special fee, essentially putting education up for sale. Some communities were more tolerant, especially in areas where minority populations were essential to the local economy. Makes sense, right? If your town's prosperity depended on Chinese miners or Hispanic ranch hands, you might be more willing to educate their children. The weird part is how some of these separate schools actually thrived. Without the pressure to conform to white educational standards, they could incorporate cultural elements that made learning more meaningful for their students. Chinese schools taught traditional calligraphy alongside English penmanship. Hispanic schools included local history that mainstream schools ignored. These weren't just academic institutions, they became centers of cultural preservation and community pride. African American families, though fewer in number in Western settlements, faced similar challenges. Some managed to establish small schools with the help of religious organizations or charitable groups from the East. Others had to send their children hundreds of miles away for any formal education beyond the basics. Let's not forget the economic factors at play. Wealthy minority families sometimes found ways around segregation by hiring private tutors or sending their children to distant cities where attitudes were more progressive. But most families didn't have those options. They were stuck with whatever limited opportunities existed locally. The determination of these excluded communities was absolutely remarkable. They refused to let discrimination crush their children's dreams of literacy and learning. While the system tried to keep them out, they built their own pathways to education. But not everyone was content with separate schools and unequal opportunities. Some families had the means to seek better options, leading to the rise of an entirely different educational landscape that would serve the wealthy and ambitious in ways public schools never could. While most Western families scrambled to get their children any education at all, wealthy folks had different plans entirely. They weren't about to send little Johnny or Mary to sit on rough wooden benches with farm kids who smelled like cow manure. No sir, they wanted something fancier. Enter the world of private academies and mission schools. These exclusive institutions popped up wherever enough rich families gathered. Think of them as the country clubs of education. Parents paid serious money, sometimes $200 to $400 per year when most teachers earned less than that total. But hey, you got what you paid for. Private academies offered Latin, French, advanced mathematics and literature courses that would make a one-room schoolhouse teacher's head spin. The academies didn't mess around with mixed-age classrooms either. They separated students by actual grade levels and hired multiple teachers. Some even imported educators from back east, complete with fancy degrees and proper teaching certificates. These schools boasted real blackboards, store-bought textbooks and desks that didn't wobble when you leaned on them. Then there's the interesting case of Catholic missions scattered throughout the frontier. While wealthy academies served the elite, missions often took the opposite approach. They focused on educating poor children, Native Americans and immigrant families that mainstream schools wouldn't touch. Mission schools operated on donated funds and volunteer labor, but they still provided more structured education than most public options. Catholic sisters ran many of these mission schools with iron discipline and genuine dedication. They taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside religious instruction. Students learned prayers in multiple languages and received moral education that public schools couldn't legally provide. The nuns often worked for free, living in cramped quarters and surviving on donated food. But here's where things get really interesting. Some ethnic communities decided to skip the whole debate about white schools versus mission schools. They created their own educational centers instead. Chinese immigrants in mining towns established schools that taught both English and Mandarin. Mexican families formed academias that preserved Spanish language and culture while preparing children for American society. These community-run schools operated in a gray area between public and private education. Parents pooled resources to hire teachers, rent buildings and buy supplies. The curriculum mixed practical American subjects with cultural preservation. Kids learned to navigate both worlds, speaking perfect English at the general store but maintaining their heritage at home. German communities were particularly good at this balancing act. They established schools that taught German literature and history alongside American civics. Lutheran churches often sponsored these institutions, creating a network of educational centers that served immigrant families throughout the West. Private academies had their own peculiar challenges though. Wealthy families expected results, and they weren't shy about demanding changes. If parents didn't like a teacher's methods or curriculum choices, they simply threatened to take their money elsewhere. This created intense pressure on educators to satisfy demanding customers rather than focus purely on learning. The social dynamics got complicated too. Academy students knew they were different from public school kids. And it showed. They wore better clothes, spoke with refined accents, and often looked down on children from farming families. This created lasting divisions in many Western communities. Mission schools faced different problems entirely. Funding was always uncertain, depending on donations from distant benefactors who might lose interest or face their own financial troubles. Teachers worked under difficult conditions, often managing overcrowded classrooms with minimal supplies. Yet mission schools achieved something remarkable. They educated children that the public system ignored or actively excluded. Native American students learned to read and write in schools that respected their humanity, even if they didn't always respect their culture. Poor immigrant children gained literacy skills that opened doors to better opportunities. The contrast between elite academies and humble mission schools revealed deep truths about frontier society. Money bought privilege, just like everywhere else. But dedicated teachers in both settings genuinely cared about their students' futures, whether those students arrived in fancy carriages or walked barefoot through mud. Private education also created an interesting competition with public schools. When wealthy families had alternatives, they put less pressure on local governments to improve public education. Why fight for better teachers or supplies when you could just pay for private school? This dynamic slowed reforms that might have helped everyone. Some private schools eventually evolved into the first high schools in their regions. As communities grew larger and more prosperous, exclusive academies opened their doors wider. Former private institutions became public high schools, bringing their higher standards and advanced curricula to broader populations. The weird part is how these educational experiments influenced American schooling for decades. Ideas tested in private academies, like grade-level separation and specialized teachers, eventually spread to public systems. Mission school techniques for working with diverse populations became models for later integration efforts. While most frontier children endured the chaos of one-room schoolhouses, private academies and missions were quietly developing educational innovations. But even these better-funded institutions couldn't solve the biggest challenge facing Western education: the complete absence of high schools. Building a high school in the Wild West was like trying to convince folks they needed a fancy carriage when most were still walking barefoot. The very first public high school had opened in Boston back in 1821, but that might as well have been on the moon for most frontier families. While East Coast cities were debating advanced curricula and college preparation, Western towns were still celebrating when they managed to keep their one-room schoolhouse open for a full year. The numbers tell the whole story. By 1890, only 7% of American teenagers were enrolled in high school anywhere in the country. Out west, those numbers dropped to practically nothing. Most rural children finished their formal education by age 14, if they were lucky enough to get that far. High school was a luxury that seemed about as practical as teaching horses to read Shakespeare. But here's the thing about Western communities: they had big dreams, even when their bank accounts were small. Towns that could barely afford a decent teacher for their elementary students started eyeing the possibility of advanced education. Having a high school meant serious business. It separated the real towns from the temporary camps that might blow away with the next gold rush. The challenge was enormous. Where do you find teachers qualified to teach advanced mathematics, Latin or natural philosophy, in places where the closest university graduate might be 3 states away? Most frontier teachers were doing well to handle basic reading and arithmetic for mixed age groups. Suddenly asking them to prepare students for college entrance exams was like asking a blacksmith to perform brain surgery. Then there's the question of who actually wanted this advanced education. Farmers needed their sons working the land, not studying ancient history. Ranch families saw more value in practical skills than in memorizing poetry. The idea of spending 4 more years in school when there was money to be made and work to be done seemed downright wasteful to many parents. Yet some families began to see the bigger picture. The West wouldn't stay wild forever. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, and businessmen would be needed as these rough settlements grew into proper cities. A few forward-thinking parents realized that education might be their children's ticket to a better life than endless manual labor. The earliest Western high schools were often hybrid institutions that would make modern educators scratch their heads. They might offer advanced classes 3 days a week and basic elementary instruction the other 2 days. One teacher might handle both calculus and beginning spelling, depending on who showed up that day. Makes sense, right? When you're working with limited resources, you get creative. Private academies filled some of the gap, but they were expensive and usually located in larger towns. Wealthy mining families or successful merchants could afford to send their children to these institutions, but average frontier families were left out entirely. The gap between rich and poor became especially obvious when it came to advanced education. Religious organizations stepped in where public funding fell short. Catholic missions, Protestant academies, and denominational schools offered high school-level courses alongside their regular elementary programs. Sometimes the local preacher doubled as the advanced mathematics teacher, creating some interesting combinations of spiritual guidance and algebraic equations. Distance created its own set of problems. A town might scrape together enough money and students for a high school, only to realize that kids living more than a day's ride away couldn't attend. Boarding arrangements became necessary, but that added another layer of expense that most families couldn't handle. The subjects taught in these early Western high schools reflected both ambition and practicality. Sure, there might be Latin and literature for college-bound students, but you'd also find surveying, bookkeeping, and basic law. These schools understood their graduates needed skills that would actually help them succeed in frontier society. Equipment and supplies posed constant headaches. Try teaching chemistry without proper lab equipment or geography with maps that were outdated before they arrived by wagon train. Many high school teachers became masters of improvisation, creating their own materials and demonstrations from whatever they could find locally. But the weird part is how quickly attitudes began to shift once these high schools proved their worth. Towns with advanced educational opportunities started attracting more educated settlers. Property values increased. New businesses opened. The high school became a symbol of progress and permanence that drew investment and growth. Female students faced particular challenges in these early high schools. While elementary education was generally accepted for girls, advanced learning raised eyebrows. What did a future wife and mother need with algebra or Latin? Yet determined young women pushed forward anyway, often becoming some of the most successful graduates. The calendar flexibility that worked for elementary schools created chaos for high school programs. How do you maintain continuity in advanced subjects when half your students disappear during planting season? These schools had to develop creative solutions that would satisfy both educational requirements and economic reality. While most Western communities were still struggling with basic literacy, a few visionary places were already laying groundwork for something even more ambitious. The teaching methods these early high schools developed would shape education across the frontier for generations to come. Building a school was one thing, but actually teaching dozens of kids ranging from 5 to 18 years old, that was something else entirely. Teachers in the Wild West had to master a juggling act that would make modern educators break out in a cold sweat. The backbone of frontier education was recitation. Students would stand up, face the class, and recite their lessons word for word, no stumbling allowed. Teachers drilled facts into young minds through endless repetition until multiplication tables and poetry verses became second nature. This wasn't about understanding concepts deeply, it was about cramming essential knowledge into heads that might only stay in school for a few years. But here's where things got creative. With 30 students spanning 13 grade levels, teachers couldn't possibly give individual attention to everyone, so they divided the room into age groups. The youngest kids, we're talking 5 and 6-year-olds, would huddle near the teacher's desk for basic alphabet lessons. Meanwhile, teenagers worked on advanced arithmetic at the back of the room, completely unsupervised. Well, not completely unsupervised. The older students became unofficial teaching assistants. A 16-year-old who had mastered long division would help the 10-year-olds with their multiplication. This peer teaching system wasn't just practical, it was brilliant. The older kids reinforced their own learning by explaining concepts, while younger students often understood lessons better when taught by someone closer to their age. Teachers explained new concepts in the morning when minds were fresh. They'd gather one age group around the blackboard, demonstrate a math problem or spelling rule, then send those kids off to practice while calling up the next group. The weird part is how well this system actually worked. Students learned to be independent learners out of necessity. Then there was dictation, the absolute terror of every frontier student. Teachers would read passages aloud, while students frantically scribbled every word on their slates. One mistake meant starting over. Penmanship had to be perfect. Spelling flawless. These exercises served double duty, improving both writing skills and knowledge retention simultaneously. Geography lessons mixed practical skills with book learning. Students memorized state capitals and river names. Sure, but they also learned to read maps and understand terrain. Makes sense, right? In a world where getting lost could mean death, map reading wasn't just academic. It was survival. Let's not forget the drilling. Endless, repetitive drilling. Students chanted arithmetic tables until they could recite them in their sleep. They spelled words over and over, until their fingers cramped. Teachers fired rapid questions across the room. What's 7 times 8? Spell necessary. Name 3 exports of California. Quick answers were expected. Hesitation was weakness. But the most interesting teaching method was what happened during busy work time. While the teacher worked intensively with one age group, the rest of the students weren't just sitting idle. Older kids helped younger ones with reading. Middle-aged students practiced penmanship or worked through arithmetic problems. The classroom buzzed with quiet learning activity. Some teachers got remarkably creative with limited resources. They'd use corn kernels for counting exercises. Pressed flowers became science specimens. Local rocks turned into geology lessons. When textbooks were scarce, teachers made learning materials from whatever was available. A teacher in Kansas once taught an entire unit on measurement using nothing but rope and fence posts. And the weird part is how these frontier teachers handled discipline while teaching. They couldn't pause lessons to deal with misbehavior. There simply wasn't time. So they developed a system of silent signals and consequences. A pointed look meant stop immediately. Moving closer to a troublemaker while continuing to teach sent a clear message. Physical punishment came later, after lessons ended. Morning recitations became competitive events. Students tried to outdo each other with perfect deliveries of poems or historical speeches. Teachers encouraged this rivalry because it motivated everyone to prepare thoroughly. Nothing motivated a frontier kid quite like the possibility of showing up their neighbor. The teaching methods might seem harsh by today's standards, but they produced remarkable results. Students who attended these one-room schools often emerged with better basic skills than many modern graduates. They could calculate complex problems in their heads, write in beautiful script, and recite entire literary works from memory. These teaching techniques shaped generations of Americans who would go on to build railroads, establish businesses, and govern new states. The methods were demanding, sometimes brutal, but undeniably effective for their time and circumstances. However, all these sophisticated teaching methods meant nothing if students couldn't actually attend school regularly. The frontier's harsh realities often kept desks empty, creating challenges that went far beyond classroom management. Teachers in one-room schoolhouses faced a reality that modern educators would find absolutely shocking. Most frontier schools operated for barely 8 months each year. Some lucky districts managed 9 months, but many struggled to keep their doors open even that long. The school calendar wasn't decided by some distant education board. It bent completely to the harsh demands of frontier life. Summer breaks weren't about giving kids time to play or attend camp. They existed because every able-bodied child was needed in the fields. Wheat didn't harvest itself, and corn required constant attention during the growing season. Families depended on their children's labor to survive another year. A teacher who tried to hold classes during peak farming season would find herself talking to empty desks. But here's where it gets interesting. Winter posed the opposite problem. Those brutal frontier winters didn't just make travel difficult, they made it downright deadly. When blizzards rolled across the plains, schools stayed closed for weeks at a time. Some remote districts shut down completely from December through February. Frozen inkwells and unheatable schoolrooms made learning nearly impossible anyway. The weird part is how flexible these calendars became. Each community basically invented its own school year based on local needs. Farming towns might start classes in late fall after harvest, run through early spring, then resume briefly in midsummer. Mining communities followed different patterns entirely, sometimes closing schools when ore strikes demanded every available worker. Teachers had to cram an entire year's worth of learning into these shortened sessions. Makes sense, right? If you only had 6 or 7 months to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history to students ranging from age 5 to 18, every single day mattered. There was no time for lengthy introductions or gentle review periods. Lessons moved fast, and students either kept up or fell behind. Then there's the matter of attendance within those short school years. Even when school was officially in session, daily attendance remained wildly unpredictable. A sudden early frost might pull half the older boys out of class to help save crops. Spring carving season could empty seats for weeks. Prairie fires, cattle drives, and family emergencies constantly interrupted education. Smart teachers learned to work around these interruptions rather than fight them. They'd assign older students to help younger ones catch up after absences. Critical lessons got repeated multiple times throughout the year, knowing that different students would miss different sessions. The best teachers treated their shortened school year like a military campaign. Every day was precious, and nothing could be wasted. Well, this created some interesting teaching strategies. Multiplication tables got drilled relentlessly during the first few weeks of school because teachers knew they'd lose students later. Reading lessons started immediately, with no warm-up period. Penmanship practice happened daily because there simply wasn't time to spread it out over a leisurely 10-month schedule. But why did communities accept such short school years? The answer reveals something crucial about frontier priorities. Education mattered, sure, but survival mattered more. A family that kept their children in school during harvest time might not have enough food stored for winter. Kids who missed spring planting to conjugate verbs might watch their families go hungry the following year. The financial reality made these short sessions even more challenging. Most teachers were paid by the month, so shorter school years meant smaller paychecks. Many teachers had to find other work during the off months, waiting tables, sewing, or even working in the fields themselves. This constant job switching made it hard to keep good teachers, which only made the education challenges worse. And the weird part is how much learning actually happened in these compressed time frames. Students who attended regularly often advanced faster than their counterparts in longer school sessions back east. The intensity and focus required by shortened school years created surprisingly effective learning environments. No time for fooling around when you only had 6 months to master a year's worth of material. Some districts tried creative solutions to extend their school years. They'd hire teachers willing to work for room and board during slow months, keeping schools open with skeleton crews of students. Others attempted split sessions, morning classes for younger children who weren't needed for heavy labor, evening sessions for older students who worked during the day. The shortened school year created one more unexpected challenge. It made teacher isolation even worse. Already stuck in remote communities with few social opportunities, teachers now faced months of unemployment between school sessions. Many used these breaks to return home or search for better positions, creating constant turnover that disrupted educational continuity. These compressed learning schedules would shape American education in ways nobody expected at the time. The intensity and efficiency required to teach effectively in such short windows influenced teaching methods that lasted well into the 20th century. But managing these jam-packed school years was just one part of the daily dangers teachers and students faced in frontier classrooms, dangers that went far beyond academic challenges. Disease hit frontier schools like a wildfire through dry grass. One sick child could wipe out an entire classroom within days. Smallpox, typhoid, diphtheria, and whooping cough didn't care if you were the smartest kid in class or the teacher's pet. They just spread. Most schoolhouses packed 30 or 40 children into spaces barely big enough for 20 adults. Kids sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, sharing the same water bucket, breathing the same stale air. When little Mary started coughing on Monday, half the class would be homesick by Friday. The other half, well, they'd probably join them the following week. Teachers became amateur doctors out of necessity. They learned to spot the early signs of measles, check for fevers with the back of their hand, and send kids home before they infected everyone else. But sometimes it was already too late. Disease moved faster than a teacher's watchful eye. Then, there's the grim reality. Nobody talks much about anymore. Many frontier schools had small cemeteries nearby, and not just for show, children died. A lot. Diphtheria could kill a healthy 8-year-old in 3 days. Scarlet fever turned bright, energetic kids into tiny graves behind the schoolhouse. Parents sent their children to school each morning, knowing they might not come home. Hygiene was practically non-existent by today's standards. No running water meant no hand washing. Kids wiped their noses on their sleeves, shared pencils that had been in a dozen other mouths, and drank from the same dipper that hung by the water barrel. Makes you wonder how any of them survived, right? The water situation was particularly nasty. Most schools had one well or water source for the entire building. Everyone drank from the same cup. When that water got contaminated, the whole school got sick together. Some unlucky schools had wells too close to the privy, creating a perfect recipe for cholera and typhoid. Winter brought its own special brand of health challenges. Schools heated by a single pot-bellied stove created weird temperature zones. Kids near the stove roasted while those by the windows froze. Frostbite was common for children who walked miles to school in sub-zero weather. Some lost fingers and toes to the cold, but still showed up for lessons the next day. Accidents happened constantly in these rough and ready schoolhouses. Splinters from crude wooden desks and benches left kids with infected wounds. The iron stove burned curious hands and scorched clothing. Older boys sometimes got into serious fights during recess, leaving each other with black eyes, broken noses, and worse. Let's not forget the building hazards. Many schoolhouses were thrown together quickly, with whatever materials the community could scrounge up. Loose floorboards tripped students. Poorly fitted windows let in rain and snow. Leaking roofs created puddles that bred mosquitoes and other disease-carrying pests. The weird part is how casually everyone accepted these dangers. Death was just part of life on the frontier, and school was no exception. Parents expected to lose some children to disease or accident. Teachers planned for absences due to illness, injury, or death. The whole community understood that education came with serious risks. Some schools tried basic safety measures. They might require sick children to stay home, though families didn't always follow the rules. Money was tight, and parents needed their kids to attend when possible. A few schools invested in better ventilation or cleaner water sources, but most made do with whatever they had. Medical knowledge was primitive, even by the standards of the time. Teachers treated cuts with whatever was handy, often making infections worse. They had no understanding of germs or how diseases actually spread. Prayer was often considered the best medicine, which worked about as well as you'd expect. The isolation of frontier schools made everything worse. When a real medical emergency struck, the nearest doctor might be days away by horseback. Teachers and parents had to handle broken bones, severe burns, and life-threatening illnesses with home remedies and hope. Many times that wasn't enough. Tuberculosis was particularly devastating in poorly ventilated schoolhouses. The disease loved cramped, stuffy spaces where people coughed and wheezed together for hours each day. Once TB entered a school, it often stayed for years, slowly working its way through families and communities. But here's what's remarkable about these frontier kids and their teachers. They kept showing up. Despite the diseases, the accidents, the very real possibility of not making it home alive, they came to school. Education mattered enough to risk everything for it. That says something powerful about the human spirit and the value they placed on learning. Even with all these health and safety nightmares, these schools somehow produced literate, capable adults who built the modern American West. The dangers were real and deadly, but so was their determination to learn and teach. However, surviving the health hazards was just one part of the challenge facing frontier educators and students alike. Being a teacher in the Wild West wasn't exactly a glamorous career choice. While other folks were striking it rich mining gold or building cattle empires, school moms were scraping by on wages that barely covered their basic needs. Most female teachers earned between $35 and $40 per month, when they got paid at all. Sometimes communities ran short on cash, and teachers had to wait weeks for their meager salaries. The isolation hit hardest during those long winter months. Teachers often lived in tiny rooms behind the schoolhouse, or boarded with local families who treated them more like hired help than guests. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every move was watched, every decision scrutinized by parents who expected their children's teacher to be a moral paragon 24 hours a day. Marriage was basically forbidden for female teachers. School boards figured married women couldn't focus properly on their duties, and pregnant teachers, absolutely scandalous. This rule left many talented educators stuck in a cruel bind. Dedicate their lives to teaching other people's children while sacrificing any hope of having families of their own. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but social conventions were rigid as iron back then. Then there's the workload that would crush most people today. These teachers weren't just educators, they were janitors, nurses, disciplinarians, and sometimes even cooks all rolled into one exhausted person. They arrived at school before dawn to light the stove and stayed after dark grading papers by candlelight. Weekends meant preparing lessons for 8 different grade levels, while mending their worn-out clothes and writing letters to family back east. But here's where things get interesting. Some of these stern schoolmistresses became absolute legends in their communities. Take Martha Thompson, who taught in a Colorado mining town for 15 years, and was known for keeping a loaded shotgun behind her desk. Not for the students, mind you, but for the occasional drunk miner who stumbled into her classroom looking for trouble. She never had to use it, but word got around quickly about the school mom who meant business. The weird part is how these women managed to command respect in towns where might made right. A 5-foot-tall teacher could silence a room full of teenage boys who spent their evenings breaking horses and handling cattle. Their secret weapon, Sheer force of personality combined with the knowledge that education was the ticket out of frontier hardship. Even the roughest kids understood that crossing the school mile meant disappointing their parents. Weather created constant challenges that would send modern teachers running for desk jobs. During blizzards, teachers sometimes found themselves snowed in at school with students for days. They'd ration food, keep the stove burning, and continue lessons as if being trapped in a wooden building during a raging storm was perfectly normal. Some teachers froze their fingers writing on chalkboards in unheated classrooms, while others dealt with rattlesnakes that sought shade under their desks during scorching summers. Communication with the outside world was practically non-existent. Teachers went months without news from home, relying on occasional letters that arrived with traveling merchants or circuit riders. This isolation bred a special kind of mental toughness. They had to solve problems on their own, make quick decisions and maintain their sanity without support networks that people take for granted today. The social pressure was relentless too. Teachers were expected to attend church regularly, dress modestly, avoid drinking or dancing, and basically live like saints in communities where everyone else was raising hell on Saturday nights. One wrong move could cost them their job and their reputation. Makes sense why many of them developed reputations for being strict. They had to maintain authority while walking on eggshells every single day. Some teachers cracked under the pressure and fled back to civilization after just a few months. Others discovered inner strength they never knew they possessed. The successful ones learned to be part educator, part performer, and part survivor. They told stories that kept kids engaged, solved disputes between feuding families, and somehow managed to teach Shakespeare alongside basic arithmetic in classrooms that doubled as community meeting halls. Local legends grew around the most memorable teachers. There was Iron Kate Miller, who allegedly threw an unruly student out a second-story window into a snowbank. Whispering Mary Rodriguez never raised her voice but could make grown men apologize with just a look. These stories got bigger with each telling, but they reflected genuine respect for women who chose education over easier paths. The strange thing about these stern schoolmistresses was how they balanced toughness with genuine care for their students. They might paddle a kid for talking back in the morning, then stay after school to help that same child with reading. Their strictness came from understanding that education was often their students' only chance at a better life. But even the toughest teachers needed some kind of social outlet. And that's where the playground became their temporary refuge from adult responsibilities and community expectations. When those classroom doors finally swung open for recess, something magical happened. The same children who sat silently in rows, backs straight as fence posts, suddenly exploded into the schoolyard like steam from a kettle. This wasn't just a break from lessons, it was their chance to be kids again. Most schoolyards were nothing fancy, just a patch of dirt, maybe some grass if the town was lucky, surrounded by whatever nature provided. No jungle gyms made of metal and plastic, no rubber mats to cushion falls. The playground equipment, well, that was whatever the kids could find or make themselves. Marbles ruled the schoolyard like tiny glass kings. Boys would crouch in circles, shooting their prized Aggies and Steelies with deadly accuracy. The click of glass against glass became the soundtrack of recess. Some kids collected hundreds of marbles, carrying them in leather pouches like precious gems. Lose your favorite shooter in a game, and you might spend the whole afternoon plotting to win it back. Girls often claimed their own corner of the yard for hopscotch. They'd scratch squares into the dirt with sticks, then spend ages perfecting their hopping technique. But don't think the girls stayed quiet and proper during playtime. They could be just as competitive and loud as the boys when it came to defending their hopscotch territory. Then there were the stick games. Kids turned branches into swords, fishing poles, and magic wands. A good stick could transform any child into a knight, a cowboy, or an explorer. Teachers learned to confiscate the particularly weapon-like branches before someone lost an eye. Tag came in dozens of variations, each with its own local rules. Freeze tag, wood tag, red rover. The names changed from town to town, but the breathless running remained the same. Children would sprint around the schoolhouse, dodge behind the outhouse, and leap over fence posts with the energy of wild horses. Jump rope was serious business for the girls. They'd chant rhymes while the rope whirred through the air. Teddy bear, turn around. Teddy bear, touch the ground. Miss the rhythm, and you'd find yourself tangled in hemp rope, face red with embarrassment. But recess wasn't all fun and games. The schoolyard was where social hierarchies got established. The older boys often ruled by size and attitude. Younger kids learned quickly who to avoid, and who might offer protection. Schoolyard bullies existed back then too. though teachers were usually quick to settle disputes with a firm hand. Speaking of teachers, they kept one eye on the classroom, and another on the chaos outside. Most understood that children needed to burn off energy, but they also knew that recess fights could carry over into afternoon lessons. A wise teacher would intervene before fists started flying. Some games required actual skill and strategy. Mumblety Peg involved flipping a pocket knife to land blade first in the ground. Dangerous? Absolutely. Popular? You bet. Boys would practice for hours, developing the wrist motion needed to make their knife stick every time. Winter brought its own playground traditions. Snowball fights could turn into epic battles, with kids building snow forts and organizing elaborate attacks. Sledding happened whenever there was a decent hill nearby. Most sleds were homemade affairs, just boards with metal runners, but they got the job done. The schoolyard also served as a neutral meeting ground for children from different families. Farm kids who rarely saw neighbors could finally play with others their age. Town children mixed with ranch kids. Sometimes these playground friendships lasted for decades. Then there was the universal recess experience, getting called back inside before you were ready. That school bell could cut through any game, no matter how intense. Children would groan, dust off their clothes, and trudge back toward the schoolhouse door. The transition from wild freedom back to ordered rows of desks was always jarring. Teachers often used recess as punishment too. Misbehave in class, and you might find yourself sitting inside while everyone else played. Nothing taught obedience quite like watching your friends have fun through a dusty window. Some schools organized group games when the weather was perfect. Whole classes would play baseball with a worn leather ball and a whittled bat. These games could get competitive, with different grades challenging each other to matches. The weird part is how much kids could accomplish with so little. No fancy equipment, no organized sports leagues, no adults directing every activity, just imagination, energy, and whatever materials they could scrounge up. Those simple recess periods often provided the happiest memories of the entire school experience. Of course, all this outdoor play had to happen around the practical realities of frontier life. Which brings us to how those one-room schoolhouses actually functioned day to day, and the ingenious ways teachers and students made education work with the most basic tools imaginable. Making a one-room schoolhouse functional required more than just four walls and good intentions. These frontier educators had to get creative with whatever they could find, borrow, or build themselves. The innovations that kept these schools running weren't exactly cutting-edge technology, but they were clever solutions born from pure necessity. The pot-bellied stove dominated every schoolhouse like a cast-iron king. Usually positioned dead center in the room, this chunky heating system became the heart of daily school life. Students closest to the stove roasted during winter months, while kids near the walls practically turned into icicles. Teachers had to orchestrate a complex seating rotation throughout the day, moving frozen children closer to warmth and relocating the overheated ones to cooler spots. The stove demanded constant attention too. Someone had to feed it wood every hour or so, and that someone was usually the oldest boy in school. Then there's the matter of keeping that stove properly stocked. Parents took turns hauling wood to school, and kids often arrived each morning carrying armloads of kindling. The daily wood supply became a community responsibility that tested neighborhood cooperation. Run out of fuel on a February morning in Montana? Well, school might just close until someone could solve the heating crisis. Windows were the primary light source, which sounds simple enough until you realize how much this limited everything else. Cloudy days meant squinting at books and straining to see the blackboard. Teachers had to position students strategically, making sure the shortest kids got window seats while taller ones sat toward the back. When winter storms blocked natural light entirely, out came the kerosene lamps, assuming the school could afford them, and parents trusted children around open flames. The weird part is how many schools operated in near darkness rather than risk fire hazards. Some teachers simply dismissed students early when daylight failed, cutting lessons short but keeping everyone safe. Blackboards represented the height of classroom luxury when schools could actually afford them. Before blackboards became common, teachers relied on small individual slates that students held in their laps. Makes sense, right? But managing 30 different slates meant chaos during group lessons. You couldn't show everyone the same math problem or diagram simultaneously. When communities finally scraped together money for a real blackboard, it transformed how teaching worked. Suddenly, one teacher could present information to all students at once. The blackboard usually got mounted on the front wall, painted directly onto wood planks with special black paint mixed locally. Chalk was precious and carefully rationed. Teachers guarded their chalk supply like gold. Let's not forget the ingenuity that went into creating learning materials from absolutely nothing. Simple maps became classroom treasures, often hand-drawn by teachers who possessed decent artistic skills. A basic map of the United States might take a teacher weeks to complete, working by lamplight after school hours ended. Geography lessons depended entirely on these homemade visual aids. Charts showing the alphabet, multiplication tables, or historical timelines were painstakingly created using whatever paper could be found. Teachers begged, borrowed, and traded materials with other schools, creating informal networks for sharing educational resources across vast distances. Desk situations varied wildly depending on community resources and carpentry skills. Wealthier towns might have actual individual desks with storage spaces and inkwells, but most schools made do with long wooden benches paired with equally long plank tables. These bench and board combinations could seat 6 to 8 students in a row, making it nearly impossible for anyone to move without disrupting their entire section. The bench system created interesting social dynamics too. Where you sat determined who you talked to, worked with, and sometimes fought with throughout the entire school year. Teachers had to consider personality conflicts when assigning bench positions, essentially playing matchmaker for academic partnerships. Storage presented another constant challenge that sparked creative solutions. Schools rarely had closets, cabinets, or designated spaces for supplies. Books got stacked wherever flat surfaces existed. Coats hung on wooden pegs hammered into walls. Lunch pails lined up along windowsills or under benches. But here's what made these innovations remarkable. They worked. Despite primitive conditions and makeshift equipment, children learned to read, write, and calculate. The lack of fancy technology forced teachers to become incredibly resourceful, and students to become remarkably focused. Some schools even developed unique systems for maximizing their limited resources. Advanced students might earn the privilege of using the good pencils or sitting at the teacher's desk for special lessons. These small innovations turned basic classroom management into motivation for academic achievement. The daily routine of maintaining all this improvised equipment taught students valuable lessons about responsibility and community cooperation. Everyone had roles in keeping the school functional, from the youngest child carrying firewood to older students helping maintain the blackboard. While teachers juggled these physical challenges and makeshift innovations, they also faced the complex task of managing an entire day's worth of structured learning. The daily routine that emerged from these frontier schools created patterns that would shape American education for generations. The morning bell echoed across the frontier town at precisely 8 o'clock. That simple iron bell hanging outside the one-room schoolhouse commanded more respect than the sheriff's badge. When it rang, children dropped their games, said goodbye to their horses, and shuffled inside for another day of learning. But what happened after that bell stopped ringing? The school day routine was as predictable as sunrise, yet somehow different in every frontier classroom across the Wild West. First came the morning ritual. Students lined up by age, youngest in front, oldest in back. The teacher stood at attention while everyone recited the Pledge of Allegiance or said a quick prayer. Some schools mixed both together, creating their own unique morning tradition. This wasn't just ceremony, it was crowd control. Getting 30 kids of different ages focused and quiet required strategy. Then there's the matter of attendance. Teachers called out names from their handwritten roster, marking present or absent with careful precision. Absent didn't always mean sick though. Johnny might be helping his father fix a broken wagon wheel. Sarah could be home caring for her baby brother. The teacher knew better than to ask too many questions about missing students during harvest season. Reading lessons kicked off the academic portion of the day. The youngest children sat on wooden benches near the front, stumbling through their ABCs. Meanwhile, older students worked on penmanship at their desks, copying Bible verses or poetry in perfect cursive. The teacher bounced between groups like a frontier juggler, keeping everyone busy and learning. And the weird part is how quiet these classrooms actually were. With so many different lessons happening at once, silence became golden. Students learned to whisper, to work independently, and to help each other without disturbing the teacher's current focus group. Talking out of turn earned you a swift paddle, or a humiliating corner timeout. Arithmetic came next, usually around 10 o'clock. Multiplication tables echoed through the room as students chanted in unison. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical. Older kids tackled long division problems on their slates while younger ones counted beans or corn kernels. Math was practical on the frontier. You needed to calculate crop yields, measure lumber, and handle money at the general store. Let's not forget the mid-morning break. Students rushed outside for 15 minutes of freedom, playing simple games like marbles or tag. The teacher used this time to prepare lessons, grade papers, or simply catch her breath. Managing a dozen different grade levels was exhausting work, even for the toughest frontier schoolmarm. Geography and history lessons filled the late morning hours. Students gathered around hand-drawn maps, learning about distant states and foreign countries. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Kids living on the edge of civilization studied the great cities of Europe and the eastern United States. Some had never traveled more than 50 miles from their birthplace, yet they memorized the capitals of every state and the major rivers of the world. Lunch brought its own unique frontier flavor. Students unpacked tin pails filled with biscuits, dried meat, and maybe a piece of fruit if the family was prosperous. Some kids brought nothing at all, relying on classmates to share their meals. Teachers often kept emergency food supplies for students whose families were struggling through tough times. The afternoon session started with penmanship practice. Perfect handwriting was considered a mark of good breeding and proper education. Students copied famous quotes, poems, or moral lessons in their best script. Teachers were ruthless critics, circling every imperfect letter and demanding students rewrite entire pages. But why was penmanship so important? Simple. Good handwriting was your ticket to better employment. Store clerks, bank tellers, and government workers all needed clear, legible script. Poor penmanship could cost you a job opportunity. Science and nature studies rounded out the academic day. Students examined pressed flowers, studied basic astronomy, or learned about the human body. Lessons were simple but practical, understanding weather patterns, identifying poisonous plants, and recognizing signs of illness in livestock. This wasn't abstract learning, it was survival education wrapped in academic clothing. The final bell rang around 3 o'clock, though timing varied by season and local needs. Students lined up again, received their homework assignments, and headed home to evening chores. Some faced long walks or horseback rides to reach their family farms. Others lived just down the street from the schoolhouse. Teachers stayed behind to clean the classroom, prepare tomorrow's lessons, and maintain the wood stove. Their day was far from over, but the controlled chaos of the school day was finally complete. What happened when formal graduation ceremonies became important enough to interrupt this daily routine? The answer reveals just how much frontier education was evolving beyond these simple structured days. Moving from elementary lessons to whatever came next wasn't exactly like today's cap and gown ceremonies. Most frontier schools didn't have formal graduation events at all. Kids simply outgrew the schoolhouse when they turned 14 or 15, heading straight into adult responsibilities without fanfare or diplomas. The concept of moving up happened naturally in one-room schoolhouses. A student might spend 8 years mastering reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside children of all ages. When they could handle advanced McGuffey readers and solve complex arithmetic problems, everyone knew they'd finished their education, no ceremony required. Their desk simply became available for the next young student walking through the door. But hold on, some communities did create special events to show off what their schools accomplished. These weren't graduations in our modern sense, they were recitation nights, spelling bees, and public demonstrations designed to prove the school's worth to skeptical townspeople who'd invested their hard-earned money in education. Recitation nights drew packed crowds of parents, merchants, and curious neighbors. Students stood before the entire community, reciting lengthy poems, mathematical tables, and historical speeches they'd memorized throughout the year. 8-year-olds might recite the Gettysburg Address while teenagers tackled Shakespeare sonnets or complex geography lessons about distant continents. The pressure was intense. Forget a line, and you'd face public embarrassment in front of everyone you knew. These events served multiple purposes beyond showing student progress. They proved the teachers' competence to community leaders who controlled hiring decisions. A successful recitation night meant job security for another year. A poor performance might lead to swift dismissal and a search for new employment in the next town over. Then there were the spelling competitions that turned education into entertainment. Communities treated spelling bees like sporting events, with rivalries between different schools and districts. Students studied word lists for months, practicing pronunciation and definitions until they could spell chrysanthemum and parallelogram without hesitation. Winners earned genuine respect and sometimes small prizes donated by local businesses. End-of-year programs featured song speeches and dramatic presentations that transformed simple schoolhouses into makeshift theaters. Students performed patriotic songs, acted out historical scenes, and delivered original speeches about moral topics like honesty, hard work, and respect for elders. Parents sat on hard wooden benches, beaming with pride as their children demonstrated skills that many adults in the audience had never mastered themselves. Certificates of completion existed in larger towns, but they were hardly universal. These simple documents, often handwritten by teachers, acknowledged that a student had completed the available coursework. They weren't legal documents or requirements for employment. Most employers cared more about a young person's work ethic and practical skills than any piece of paper. The weird part is how different expectations were for boys and girls during these informal graduation processes. Boys typically left school earlier, around age 12 or 13, when farming or trade work demanded their full attention. Their graduation meant picking up adult responsibilities immediately, managing livestock, learning carpentry, or helping with family businesses. Girls sometimes continued school longer, especially during winter months when household demands decreased. Their extended education wasn't necessarily about academic advancement. Communities expected educated young women to become the next generation of teachers, at least until marriage ended their professional careers. High school diplomas remained incredibly rare throughout the frontier period. Only 7% of American teenagers attended high school in 1890, and most of those lived in established eastern cities rather than western settlements. A frontier child who completed 8th grade education had achieved something genuinely impressive by contemporary standards. Makes sense, right? When survival depended on practical skills like farming, ranching, and homemaking, extended academic study seemed like an unaffordable luxury. Families needed working hands more than scholars. Some communities developed creative solutions for recognizing educational achievement. Teachers maintained careful records of student progress, noting reading levels, mathematical competencies, and moral development. These informal transcripts helped families and employers understand what skills young people had mastered, even without formal diplomas. Religious communities sometimes combined educational recognition with spiritual milestones. A student's completion of schooling might coincide with confirmation ceremonies or other faith-based transitions to adulthood. Education and spiritual growth intertwined in ways that modern secular schools wouldn't recognize. The absence of formal graduation ceremonies didn't diminish the real pride communities felt in their educational achievements. Every child who learned to read and write represented a victory against frontier hardships. Every successful recitation night proved that civilization was taking root in wild places. Well, these informal celebrations and simple recognition systems worked well enough for one-room schoolhouses. But as communities grew larger and more prosperous, they began demanding more from their educational systems. The basic 3 R's weren't quite enough anymore. Parents wanted their children to learn geography, history, and even basic science. Basic reading, writing, and arithmetic might have formed the backbone of frontier education, but ambitious teachers and growing communities weren't content to stop there. As settlements matured and gained confidence, schoolhouses began expanding their offerings beyond the bare essentials. Geography lessons suddenly appeared on chalkboards, complete with hand-drawn maps that looked more like abstract art than actual continents. Teachers would sketch rough outlines of states and countries, often relying on their own questionable artistic skills and fading memories from their own schooling. Students learned about distant places they'd probably never see, memorizing capital cities and major rivers while sitting in classrooms where the nearest major city might be hundreds of miles away. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Kids living on the actual frontier were studying about exotic foreign lands from textbooks that barely mentioned their own territories. History lessons proved equally challenging and entertaining. Teachers cobbled together stories about ancient civilizations, the Revolutionary War, and recent events, often mixing facts with local folklore. Well, at least they tried. One teacher in Colorado reportedly told students that George Washington crossed the Delaware River to fight bears, which the children accepted without question until a traveling preacher corrected the tale months later. Basic science crept into curriculum as communities grew more sophisticated. Teachers demonstrated simple principles using whatever materials they could find. Magnifying glasses became precious teaching tools for studying insects and plants. Glass jars turned into impromptu laboratories for mixing substances that sometimes produced unexpected and aromatic results. Students learned about weather patterns by observing the very real storms that occasionally sent everyone scrambling for shelter mid-lesson. Music instruction depended entirely on community resources and teacher talents. Towns lucky enough to own a piano or organ could offer proper music lessons. Others made do with harmonicas, fiddles, or whatever instruments families could spare. Singing became the most common musical education, with students learning popular songs, hymns, and patriotic tunes that echoed across schoolyards during recess. The weird part is how gender determined which extra subjects students could access. Older girls often received sewing instruction, learning to mend clothing and create basic household items. These lessons served practical purposes in communities where store-bought goods remained expensive luxuries. Girls mastered embroidery, quilting, and fabric repair skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Boys, meanwhile, might receive basic woodworking instruction or farming tips from teachers who understood that most male students would eventually work with their hands. They learned to sharpen tools, identify different wood types, and understand crop rotation principles. Some teachers incorporated blacksmithing basics or animal husbandry knowledge, recognizing that frontier life demanded diverse practical skills. Art lessons happened sporadically, constrained by limited supplies and teacher expertise. Students drew with charcoal on whatever paper they could find, creating portraits of family members or sketching local landscapes. Watercolors were rare treasures, shared carefully among entire classes. Clay work used local materials when available, though most artistic expression remained confined to pencil drawings and occasional chalk illustrations. Then there were the teachers who pushed boundaries by introducing subjects that seemed almost revolutionary for one-room schoolhouses. Some brave educators attempted foreign language instruction, usually Latin for its connection to medicine and law, or Spanish in southwestern territories where it proved genuinely useful. French occasionally appeared in curricula, though students wondered why they needed to conjugate verbs for a language they'd likely never encounter. Philosophy and debate emerged in more advanced schools, where older students could engage with complex ideas. Teachers encouraged discussions about government, ethics, and social issues, creating miniature town halls within their classrooms. These conversations often proved more engaging than traditional recitation exercises and helped develop critical thinking skills that served students well in their adult lives. Let's not forget the practical mathematics that extended beyond basic arithmetic. Advanced students learned geometry principles for construction projects, basic surveying techniques, and bookkeeping skills essential for running businesses or farms. Teachers who possessed these specialized skills became particularly valuable to their communities. Physical education existed informally through outdoor activities and games, but some teachers structured exercise periods that combined fun with fitness. Students learned traditional dances, participated in organized races, and practiced calisthenics routines that were supposed to improve their posture and health. The challenge lay in balancing these expanded offerings with the fundamental subjects that remained most important. Teachers had to ensure students mastered reading and arithmetic while still providing enriching experiences through additional subjects. Time constraints meant that extra lessons often happened during lunch breaks, after regular school hours, or whenever weather kept students indoors longer than usual. Not every school could offer extensive additional subjects, but ambitious teachers found creative ways to broaden their students' horizons within existing constraints. They understood that education meant more than memorizing multiplication tables. It meant preparing young people for whatever futures awaited them beyond the schoolhouse walls. But expanding curriculum was only part of how frontier schools adapted to changing times. Technology was beginning to transform these isolated classrooms in ways that would reshape education forever. The telegraph clicked its way into frontier towns like a mechanical gossip, spreading news faster than anyone thought possible. One day you were waiting months for a letter from back east, the next day messages zipped across the country in minutes. Schools suddenly had access to information that would have taken weeks to arrive by wagon train. Teachers who once relied on outdated textbooks and whatever books families brought from home could now order fresh materials. The railroad followed close behind the telegraph lines, carrying crates of new books, maps, and supplies that transformed dusty one-room schoolhouses. A teacher in Nebraska could request the same geography textbook being used in Boston schools. Well, assuming the town had enough money to pay for it. But here's the weird part: sheer technology arrived unevenly across the Wild West. Some towns got telegraph offices and rail connections while neighboring settlements remained completely cut off from the modern world. A school 20 miles away might still be teaching from a Bible and an old almanac, while another school received shipments of brand new McGuffey readers and detailed world maps. The telegraph brought more than just faster mail service. News of scientific discoveries, political events, and educational innovations spread rapidly between communities. Teachers learned about new teaching methods being tried in Eastern schools. They heard about the latest medical knowledge that could help them spot diseases in their classrooms. Information that once took months to travel now arrived within days. Then there was the railroad's massive impact on what schools could actually obtain. Before trains reached western towns, every book, slate, piece of chalk, and school bell had to survive a dangerous journey by wagon train. Many supplies never made it due to weather, bandits, or simple accidents. The railroad changed everything by delivering reliable shipments of educational materials. Science lessons got particularly exciting when new inventions became common knowledge. Teachers could explain how the telegraph worked, even if their students had never seen the actual equipment. Lessons about electricity, steam engines, and mechanical innovations became part of the curriculum. Kids who might never travel beyond their county borders learned about the Industrial Revolution happening in distant cities. Let's not forget that wealthy towns benefited far more than poor settlements. A prosperous mining town with railroad access could afford to order scientific instruments, detailed charts, and the latest textbooks. Meanwhile, a struggling farming community might still share 3 outdated books between 20 students. The technology gap widened the education divide between rich and poor communities. Maps became incredibly important as railroads expanded. Teachers used large wall maps to show students how their remote towns connected to the rest of America. Kids learned about states they'd never visit and cities they couldn't imagine. Geography lessons transformed from abstract concepts to practical knowledge about the rapidly changing country. School buildings themselves adapted slowly to technological improvements. The basic pot-bellied stove remained the heating system of choice for decades. Most schools still relied on natural light from windows and kerosene lamps for evening events. Running water and indoor plumbing remained luxuries that few frontier schools enjoyed, even as these innovations became common in eastern cities. But why did some schools embrace new ideas while others resisted change? Community attitudes played a huge role. Towns focused on growth and progress, eagerly adopted new teaching methods and materials. Conservative communities preferred traditional approaches and viewed newfangled educational ideas with suspicion. A forward-thinking teacher might introduce innovative lessons in one town while facing resistance in another. The weird part about technological impact was how it affected different subjects differently. Science and geography lessons improved dramatically with access to current information and better materials. Reading instruction benefited from standardized textbooks and teaching guides. Mathematics remained largely unchanged since basic arithmetic didn't require cutting-edge resources. Access to newspapers via rail delivery gave schools their first regular source of current events. Teachers could discuss national politics, economic developments, and social changes with their students. These newspapers became unofficial textbooks for civics and history lessons, making distant events relevant to frontier children. Communication improvements also meant teachers could correspond with colleagues in other towns. They shared successful lesson plans, discussed challenging students, and supported each other through the isolation of frontier teaching. A teachers' network expanded beyond their immediate community for the first time. The impact wasn't always positive, though. Some traditional skills got less attention as schools focused on modern subjects. Practical knowledge that frontier children needed for survival sometimes took a backseat to academic topics considered more civilized or progressive. Technology's uneven spread created interesting situations where neighboring schools operated in completely different worlds. One teacher might be using the latest educational innovations while another taught exactly the same way teachers had for decades. Makes you wonder how different the daily experience could be just a few miles apart, right? Despite the challenges and limitations, technology gradually transformed Wild West education. The foundation was being laid for more systematic, standardized schooling that would eventually reshape American education entirely. Yet the daily reality for most frontier teachers remained remarkably challenging, as we'll discover next. Being a one-room schoolhouse teacher wasn't exactly what you'd call a cushy job. While most people had one role to master, these educational pioneers juggled more responsibilities than a circus performer. Every single day brought a fresh batch of headaches that would make modern teachers grateful for their specialized roles and support staff. The biggest nightmare: managing students aged 5 to 18, all crammed into one space. Picture trying to teach multiplication tables to 8-year-olds while simultaneously explaining Shakespeare to teenagers. Meanwhile, the 5-year-olds are picking their noses, and the 16-year-olds are plotting mischief. Teachers had to develop eyes in the back of their heads and the patience of saints. Lesson planning became an art form of creative chaos. A typical teacher might start the morning drilling younger children on their ABCs, then pivot to helping 10-year-olds with arithmetic, before diving into geography with the older students. All this happened within minutes of each other, with constant interruptions and questions flying from every corner of the room. The mental gymnastics required were exhausting. Then there's the matter of classroom management. When little Jimmy started a spitball war while Susan was reciting poetry, the teacher had to handle discipline swiftly and fairly. But here's the kicker: they couldn't just send troublemakers to the principal's office. They were the principal, janitor, nurse and counselor, all rolled into one overwhelmed package. Let's not forget the physical demands of the job. Teachers arrived early to light the wood stove in winter, often chopping kindling themselves when supplies ran low. They swept floors, cleaned chalkboards, and maintained the outhouse. Some even prepared simple meals for students who brought nothing from home. By the time the school day officially started, they'd already put in hours of manual labor. The isolation factor hit hard, especially for young women fresh from back east. Many teachers lived alone in tiny quarters behind the schoolhouse or boarded with local families. Social opportunities were practically non-existent. After spending all day with children, they faced long, lonely evenings preparing for the next day's lessons by candlelight or kerosene lamp. Weather created constant headaches too. Blizzards might trap everyone inside for days, turning the schoolhouse into an impromptu shelter. Teachers had to keep children calm, entertained and warm, while rationing whatever food was available. Summer brought different challenges: sweltering heat, dust storms, and the distraction of outdoor adventures calling to restless students. Resource management required the creativity of a magician. With maybe 3 textbooks for 20 students, teachers had to devise ingenious ways to share materials. They created lessons from whatever was handy: old newspapers, seed catalogs, or personal books brought from home. Making educational magic happen with virtually nothing became their specialty. Discipline presented particularly tricky situations. When dealing with teenagers nearly their own age, young teachers had to establish authority without appearing weak or harsh. Some students tested boundaries relentlessly, especially boys who towered over their female instructors. Teachers developed reputations quickly. Word spread fast about who could maintain order and who couldn't handle the pressure. The emotional toll was brutal. Teachers watched bright students drop out for farm work or family obligations, knowing these kids had real potential. They saw families struggle with poverty, illness and hardship, often unable to help beyond providing a warm meal or extra attention. The weight of community expectations added another layer of stress. Time management became an impossible puzzle. With limited daylight hours and no electric lighting, teachers crammed multiple subjects into short windows. They had to decide which lessons were essential and which could be skipped when time ran short. Every moment counted, yet interruptions were constant. Sick children, weather emergencies, or community events that required their participation. But here's what made it even tougher: the pay barely covered basic survival. Many teachers earned less per month than laborers made per week. They often worked second jobs during summers, took in sewing, or tutored wealthy families just to make ends meet. The financial stress made an already demanding job nearly unbearable. Parent relations required diplomatic skills worthy of international negotiations. Some families supported their teachers completely, while others questioned every decision. Teachers had to balance different expectations, cultural backgrounds, and educational philosophies within small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The burnout rate was astronomical. Most teachers lasted only a year or 2 before moving on to marriage, different careers, or simply escaping to somewhere less demanding. Those who stayed developed legendary reputations for toughness and dedication that lasted generations. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, many teachers found ways to thrive and make lasting impacts on their students' lives. What kept them going? Well, that's where the deeper story of survival and community support becomes essential to understanding how Wild West education actually worked. Churches and schools went together like bacon and eggs in the Wild West. Actually, scratch that. They went together more like survival and necessity. Most frontier schools didn't just happen to have religious connections, they existed because of them. Here's something that might surprise you. Many of the first schoolhouses were literally churches on weekdays. The same building where folks prayed on Sunday became where kids learned their ABCs on Monday. Makes sense, right? Communities were small, money was tight, and building 2 separate structures seemed wasteful when one could do double duty. but the connection ran deeper than just shared real estate. Church members often provided the initial funding to get schools started. They donated lumber, nails, and labor when town budgets couldn't stretch to cover a schoolhouse. The local preacher frequently doubled as the first teacher, especially in settlements too small to attract dedicated educators. Then there's the daily reality inside these classrooms. Morning prayers weren't just common, they were practically universal. Students would recite Bible verses alongside their multiplication tables. The McGuffey readers that dominated frontier education were packed with moral lessons straight from Christian teachings. Learning to read often meant learning to read scripture first. Some teachers were basically preacher-educators, rolled into one person. They'd teach arithmetic in the morning, geography after lunch, and lead prayer meetings in the evening. These teacher-preachers solved two problems at once for cash-strapped communities. Why hire two people when one could handle both spiritual and educational needs? Sunday schools added another layer to frontier education. While regular school taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, Sunday school reinforced these skills through religious study. Kids who struggled with their letters during the week got extra practice reading Bible stories on Sundays. It was remedial education disguised as worship. But here's where things got interesting, and sometimes messy. Religious differences could tear communities apart faster than a tornado through a wheat field. Catholic families in predominantly Protestant towns faced real challenges. Their kids might be welcomed in the local school, but they'd sit through Protestant prayers and Bible readings daily. Some Catholic communities responded by starting their own schools, often run by nuns who traveled west specifically for this purpose. These sisters were tough as nails and twice as dedicated. They'd establish schools in rough mining camps and cattle towns where most people wouldn't dare venture alone. Protestant denominations weren't always united either. Baptists and Methodists might disagree on doctrine strongly enough to split a school district. One group would insist on their version of morning prayers while the other demanded different hymns or Bible readings. Small towns sometimes ended up with competing schools based purely on religious differences. Native American children faced an entirely different religious educational reality. Government boarding schools weren't just about teaching reading and arithmetic. They were designed to eliminate tribal religions and replace them with Christianity. Kids were forbidden from speaking their native languages or practicing traditional ceremonies. Education became a tool for cultural destruction rather than enlightenment. Mexican and Hispanic families in newly American territories brought Catholic traditions that sometimes clashed with Protestant-dominated school boards. Their children might find themselves caught between the religion practiced at home and the Protestant prayers required at school. Some families chose to keep their kids home rather than compromise their faith. The weird part is how practical these religious connections often were. Churches had buildings, organizational structures, and committed members willing to volunteer time and money. They provided the foundation that many frontier schools desperately needed to get started and stay operational. Religious holidays shaped the entire school calendar. Christmas meant extended breaks, not just for celebration but because teachers needed time to travel home to their families. Easter brought shorter breaks but often included special programs where students recited religious poetry or performed biblical scenes for the community. Prayer wasn't just about faith, it served practical classroom management purposes too. Starting the day with prayer helped settle rowdy students and establish the teacher's authority. Ending lessons with brief prayers provided natural transitions between subjects and helped maintain order among mixed-age groups. Some of the most memorable frontier teachers were deeply religious women who saw education as their Christian calling. They'd work for minimal pay in harsh conditions because they believed they were serving God by teaching children. Their faith sustained them through lonely winters and challenging students when nothing else could. Religious conflicts sometimes reached beyond individual schools to affect entire communities. Towns split over whether to hire Catholic or Protestant teachers. School board elections became proxy wars between different denominations, with children's education caught in the crossfire. Yet for all the complications religion brought to frontier schools, it also provided stability and continuity that many communities desperately needed. Churches offered institutional memory and support systems that helped schools survive difficult periods when secular funding disappeared. But religious influence on Wild West education was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The rhythm of daily life in these frontier schools revolved around more than just prayers and Bible readings. It followed patterns shaped by seasons, celebrations, and community traditions that brought entire towns together. Religion wasn't just something that happened on Sundays in Wild West schools, it was woven into daily lessons like thread through fabric, impossible to separate from the educational experience. Teachers often doubled as moral guides, and the line between learning your ABCs and learning your scripture blurred more than parents today might expect. Morning prayers kicked off most school days across the frontier. Students would bow their heads while the teacher recited verses or led simple prayers for guidance and protection. Makes sense, right? When your schoolhouse sat miles from the nearest doctor and winter storms could trap everyone inside for days, a little divine intervention seemed pretty practical. The McGuffey readers that dominated frontier classrooms weren't just about phonics and vocabulary. These books packed moral lessons into every story, teaching children that honesty, hard work, and faith would lead to success. Students memorized passages that combined reading practice with religious instruction. One popular McGuffey tale warned against lying by following a boy whose dishonesty led to disaster, while another praised a girl whose truthfulness saved her family from ruin. But here's where things get interesting. Not every community agreed on which version of Christianity should guide their children's education. Protestant settlers often clashed with Catholic families over Bible readings and prayer styles. Some towns split their schools along denominational lines, creating separate classrooms for different faiths when they could afford it. Teachers found themselves walking a religious tightrope. They needed to satisfy the dominant faith in their community while avoiding offense to minority families. A teacher who pushed too hard on specific doctrines might find herself out of a job faster than a snake could strike. The smart ones focused on general Christian principles that most families could accept. Sunday schools often used the same building as regular classes, creating an interesting overlap between secular and religious education. Children who struggled with reading during the week might get extra practice on Sundays, working through Bible stories that reinforced their weekday lessons. The local preacher sometimes doubled as a reading tutor, especially in communities too small to support both a teacher and a minister. Then there's the fascinating case of teacher-preachers. Some frontier communities hired men who could handle both educational and spiritual duties. These dual-role leaders taught mathematics on Tuesday and delivered sermons on Sunday, often using the same building for both purposes. Their salaries came from a combination of school funds and church collections, making them essential figures in community life. Religious conflicts sometimes erupted in unexpected ways. When families from different denominations settled in the same area, arguments over which prayers to recite or which version of the Bible to use could split communities down the middle. Some towns ended up with competing schools, each claiming to offer the proper education for Christian children. Catholic missions played a unique role in frontier education, especially in areas with large Hispanic populations. These schools often provided the only formal education available to poor children, combining basic literacy with religious instruction. Mission teachers, usually nuns, brought a discipline and dedication that impressed even Protestant families desperate for educational options. The weird part is how Native American children got caught in religious crossfire. Government boarding schools used Christianity as a tool to strip away tribal identities, forcing children to abandon traditional beliefs while learning to read and write. These institutions claimed religious justification for cultural destruction that would horrify modern educators. Holiday celebrations in frontier schools revolved around Christian traditions. Christmas pageants showcased student recitation skills while teaching religious lessons. Easter brought special programs that combined poetry, songs, and biblical stories. These events drew entire communities together, making school the center of religious and social life. Prayer wasn't just reserved for special occasions. Teachers led students in asking for divine help before difficult lessons, thanking God for safe arrivals after storms, and seeking protection during illness outbreaks. When disease struck a classroom, religious faith often provided the only comfort available to frightened children and worried parents. Religious instruction varied wildly based on teacher preparation and community expectations. Some educators had received formal theological training, while others simply read from whatever religious materials they could find. The quality of spiritual education depended entirely on local resources and individual dedication. Let's not forget that many frontier families saw religious education as more important than academic subjects. Parents who couldn't read themselves still insisted that their children learn Bible verses and moral principles. They believed spiritual knowledge would guide their children through life's challenges better than arithmetic or geography ever could. The influence of religion shaped everything from classroom discipline to curriculum choices. Teachers justified strict punishment by citing biblical principles about sparing rods and spoiling children. They selected reading materials based on moral content rather than literary merit, ensuring that every lesson reinforced community values. But what happened when communities disagreed so strongly about religion that cooperation became impossible? The solutions frontier towns developed would surprise modern observers and reveal just how creative desperate parents could become. Some schoolhouses became legends long before they became museums. Take the Little Red Schoolhouse of Cedar Creek, Montana, which survived 3 different prairie fires between 1882 and 1895. The building kept standing while entire sections of town burned around it. Local folks swore it was because the teacher, Margaret O'Sullivan, had her students form bucket brigades and soak the wooden walls every time smoke appeared on the horizon. Smart woman. The school operated for 47 years and taught over 300 children before closing its doors. But not all famous schoolhouses earned their reputation through disaster survival. The Cottonwood School in Nebraska gained fame for producing more college graduates than any other one-room school in the state. Between 1878 and 1902, 23 of its students went on to universities back east. Pretty impressive for a building that measured just 20 by 30 feet. The secret? A teacher named Samuel Morrison, who refused to let distance from civilization become an excuse for mediocre education. Morrison pushed his students harder than most frontier teachers dared. He made them memorize entire Shakespeare plays, solve complex mathematics problems, and write essays that would challenge city students twice their age. Parents initially complained about the workload, but when their children started receiving acceptance letters from prestigious schools, complaints turned into praise. The man transformed a simple prairie schoolhouse into an academic powerhouse. Then there's the peculiar case of the floating school of Sacramento. California's gold rush brought such rapid population growth that traditional school building couldn't keep pace. An enterprising teacher named Captain James Wheeler converted a retired riverboat into a classroom in 1853. The vessel anchored near the docks and served children whose families lived on houseboats or moved frequently between mining camps. Students arrived by small boats, canoes, or swimming when weather allowed. Wheeler taught navigation alongside arithmetic, using the river currents as practical geography lessons. The floating classroom operated for 6 years before the city built enough land-based schools to accommodate everyone. Weather created some of the most memorable schoolhouse stories. The winter of 1888 trapped teacher Anna Morrison and 14 students inside the Plainview School in Dakota Territory for 3 days. A blizzard struck during afternoon classes, making travel impossible. Morrison kept everyone calm by turning the emergency into an extended lesson. Students practiced their penmanship by writing letters to worried families, calculated how to ration their lunch supplies, and took turns reading aloud from the only novel in the classroom. When rescue finally arrived, parents found their children better educated than when they'd left them. Some schoolhouses gained fame through sheer stubbornness. The Canyon Creek School in Arizona operated in a building that flooded every spring when mountain snow melted. Rather than relocate, the community simply accepted that classes would move outdoors for 6 weeks each year. Students learned botany by studying desert plants, practiced mathematics by calculating water flow rates, and improved their writing by documenting the annual flood patterns. The unconventional approach worked so well that visiting educators came from as far as California to observe the outdoor classroom methods. The stories weren't always about triumph over adversity. The Willow Bend School in Texas closed after just 18 months when it became clear the building had been constructed directly over an active rattlesnake den. 3 different teachers quit after encounters with the reptiles, and enrollment dropped to 0 after a particularly large snake interrupted a spelling bee. The community eventually moved the entire structure 2 miles away, but locals still called it Snake School for decades afterward. Several schoolhouses became famous for their unusual architectural features. The round school near Santa Fe was built in a perfect circle because the carpenter misunderstood the town council's request for a well-rounded education. The mistake created acoustic problems that amplified whispers into shouts and made normal conversation nearly impossible. Students developed an elaborate system of hand signals to communicate during lessons. Despite the challenges, test scores remained surprisingly high, possibly because the unique conditions forced everyone to pay closer attention. The legacy of these notable schoolhouses extends far beyond their unusual stories. Many served as community centers long after formal classes ended, hosting town meetings, wedding celebrations, and traveling entertainment. The buildings represented something larger than education. They embodied each community's determination to create civilization in an untamed landscape. These schoolhouses and their stories became the foundation of local identity. Families passed down tales of strict teachers, harsh winters, and small triumphs for generations. Children who learned in these one-room buildings carried their experiences across the country as they grew up and moved away, spreading frontier educational traditions to new communities. The most famous schoolhouses still attract visitors today, preserved as museums that showcase frontier education methods. Their survival connects us directly to an era when learning required true grit and determination. But these preserved buildings represent just a fraction of the thousands of schoolhouses that once dotted the American frontier, each with its own collection of memorable moments and local legends. While these individual stories captivate us, they emerged from a broader shift in how America approached education, driven by changing laws and evolving social expectations. Laws had a funny way of catching up to reality in the Wild West. While teachers were already juggling 8 different grade levels and praying their one-room schoolhouse wouldn't blow away in the next windstorm, politicians back east were busy writing rules about how education should work. The gap between what lawmakers imagined and what actually happened in frontier classrooms was wider than the Grand Canyon. Federal involvement in education started small but grew teeth fast. The government had strong opinions about Native American children, passing laws that forced them into boarding schools far from their families. These weren't gentle suggestions either. Federal agents would literally show up at reservations and take kids away. The idea was to kill the Indian, save the man through education. Harsh, absolutely, but that's how lawmakers thought they could solve what they saw as the Indian problem. Then there's the curious case of compulsory attendance laws. Massachusetts led the charge in 1852, declaring that all children had to attend school. Other states followed like dominoes falling in slow motion. But here's the weird part. Enforcing these laws in the Wild West was like trying to lasso smoke. Sheriff Johnson wasn't about to ride 15 miles to drag little Billy back to school when Billy was needed to help his family survive another brutal winter. School districts found creative ways around attendance rules. Some places counted a child as present if they showed up for just 3 months out of the year. Others looked the other way entirely when harvest season rolled around. The law said one thing, but frontier reality demanded something completely different. Legal battles over who could attend school created even bigger headaches. California passed laws specifically barring Chinese children from white schools in the 1870s. Hispanic families faced similar restrictions across the Southwest. African American children, forget about it in most places. These weren't just local prejudices, they were written into actual legal codes. But some communities pushed back harder than expected. In 1885, a Chinese family in San Francisco sued the school district for excluding their daughter. The case bounced around courts for years, creating a mess of legal precedents that nobody quite knew how to handle. Meanwhile, that little girl grew up without the education she deserved. Religious freedom laws added another layer of confusion to frontier schools. Some states required Bible readings, others banned them outright. Teachers found themselves caught in the middle, trying to figure out whether morning prayers would get them fired or refusing to lead them would cause the same result. Community politics mixed with state law created a recipe for constant conflict. Federal land grants actually helped more than most people realize. The government set aside sections of territory specifically for school funding, but accessing that money required jumping through bureaucratic hoops that would challenge a trained circus performer. Towns had to prove they met certain requirements, maintain enrollment numbers, and file reports that often took months to reach the appropriate offices. State education departments started requiring teacher certification around the 1880s, but what counted as qualified varied wildly. Some places demanded college degrees that barely existed west of the Mississippi. Others accepted anyone who could read, write, and hadn't been arrested recently. The disconnect between legal requirements and practical needs created a constant tug-of-war. Funding laws proved especially tricky to navigate. States promised money for rural schools, but the cash often came with strings attached that frontier communities couldn't meet. Build a school with 2 rooms when you barely had enough students for one. Install expensive equipment when your biggest concern was keeping the roof from leaking. These requirements missed the point entirely. Integration laws moved at the speed of molasses uphill in January. Even when courts ruled that all children deserved equal education, enforcement remained spotty at best. Some towns integrated quietly to avoid federal attention, others dug in their heels and fought every legal challenge for decades. The strangest part might be how little many frontier communities knew about these changing laws. Information traveled slowly, and by the time new regulations reached remote settlements they were often already outdated. Teachers sometimes operated under rules that had been repealed months earlier, simply because nobody had bothered to inform them. State supervision of schools increased gradually, But inspectors faced the same challenges as everyone else trying to navigate frontier life. Roads were terrible, distances were vast, and winter weather could strand an inspector for weeks. Many schools went years without official visits, operating in a legal grey area that nobody quite understood. Legal fights over school access would drag on well into the 20th century, creating precedents that shaped American education for generations. But even as lawmakers debated and courts ruled, frontier teachers kept doing what they'd always done, teaching whoever showed up, with whatever materials they had, under whatever conditions they faced.
False.
The real education was happening in those one-room schoolhouses regardless of what any law said. But some of the most fascinating stories emerged from the teachers themselves, the remarkable individuals who made frontier education work despite every obstacle thrown their way. Hollywood loves a good schoolhouse scene. You know the type: stern schoolmarm with a ruler, kids ducking spitballs, and maybe a gunfight interrupting arithmetic lessons.
False.
But here's the thing about those classic Western movies and TV shows: they got some stuff right, and other stuff hilariously wrong. Take the typical movie schoolhouse. It's always perfectly neat, with rows of matching desks and a teacher who looks like she stepped out of a fashion magazine. Or real frontier schoolhouses. They were lucky to have desks that matched, let alone ones that weren't held together with prayer and rusty nails. Most of those movie schoolrooms would have been the fanciest building in any real Western town. Then there's the classic Hollywood teacher, usually a prim Eastern lady who arrives on the stagecoach wearing a crisp white blouse that somehow stays spotless despite months of dust storms. She's either incredibly strict, or surprisingly sweet, but she's always ready with a dramatic speech about the power of education. Real teachers were more likely to show up exhausted, underpaid, and wondering what they'd gotten themselves into. But wait, it gets better. Movie schoolhouses always seem to attract trouble like magnets. Bank robbers burst through the door during spelling bees. Cowboys start shootouts right outside during recess. The schoolmarm inevitably gets kidnapped by outlaws, who apparently have nothing better to do than mess with local education. The weird part is, most real frontier schools were incredibly boring places where the biggest drama was whether Tommy Johnson would get the switch for talking back. Actual danger was more likely to come from a leaky roof than a gang of desperados. Hollywood also loves the idea of the teacher, who civilizes the whole town. She arrives, starts teaching manners along with multiplication, and suddenly rough cowboys are tipping their hats and saying "yes ma'am." Makes for a nice story, but real teachers were usually just trying to get through the day without losing their minds. Let's not forget the classic movie scene, where the tough gunslinger's kid refuses to go to school, leading to a showdown between father and teacher. The teacher always wins through sheer determination, and maybe a well-timed Bible verse. Real parents were more likely to keep kids home because they needed help with chores, not because they were making some philosophical statement about book learning. Movies love showing recitation contests as these dramatic events where the whole town gathers to watch kids perform. Well, that part actually happened pretty regularly. The difference: real recitation nights were about as exciting as watching paint dry, unless you counted Mrs. Henderson falling asleep during Little Sally's poem about spring flowers. Then there's the Hollywood version of discipline. Movie teachers either never punish anyone, or they're wielding that ruler like a weapon. Real frontier teachers used whatever worked, and what worked varied wildly depending on the kids, the community, and how much coffee the teacher had managed to drink that morning. Western shows also love the dramatic moment when education saves the day. The school teacher uses geometry to help catch the bad guys, or little Timmy's reading skills reveal the villain's secret plan. In reality, most frontier kids were just hoping to learn enough reading and arithmetic to help run the family business someday. But here's what Hollywood did get right: the incredible importance people placed on having a school. Those movie scenes where townspeople come together to build a schoolhouse or defend their teacher, that actually happened. Communities really did see education as their ticket to respectability and progress. Movies also captured something true about the isolation teachers faced. Those scenes of the lonely schoolmarm eating dinner alone, or writing letters to family back east. That was real life for many frontier teachers. The dramatic romance with the local sheriff was optional, and Hollywood wasn't wrong about the one-room schoolhouse being the heart of many communities. Those movie scenes showing school plays, graduation ceremonies and community meetings in the schoolhouse reflected reality. These buildings really were gathering places where important decisions got made. The funny thing about all these movie myths is how they've shaped what Americans think frontier education was like. People expect dramatic stories and heroic teachers, when the real story was mostly about ordinary people doing their best under tough circumstances. Western movies turned frontier teachers into legends, sometimes heroic, sometimes comical, but always larger than life. The reality was both more mundane and more impressive than anything Hollywood dreamed up. But those Hollywood stories did capture something important about the American belief in education as a civilizing force. Even if the details were wrong, the spirit wasn't far off. Of course, behind all those dramatic schoolhouse scenes lies a deeper truth about what frontier education actually accomplished, and that legacy turned out to be more lasting than any movie. When the dust finally settled on the Wild West era, something remarkable had happened. Those tiny one-room schoolhouses scattered across the frontier had quietly transformed an entire nation's relationship with learning. The impact wasn't just local, it rippled through generations. Here's what makes this story incredible. Literacy rates in remote frontier towns often matched or even exceeded those in established eastern cities. How did that happen? Well, when your survival depends on reading land grants, understanding contracts and keeping accurate records, education becomes more than nice to have, it becomes essential. Frontier families didn't treat school as optional entertainment. They saw it as the difference between prosperity and poverty. But the legacy goes deeper than just reading and writing skills. Wild West schools pioneered what we now call individualized learning, without even knowing it. Teachers had no choice but to meet each student where they were. Whether that was a 5-year-old learning letters, or an 18-year-old tackling advanced mathematics. This wasn't some fancy educational theory, it was pure necessity, and it worked. Then there's the community involvement aspect that modern schools still struggle to recreate. Parents didn't just drop kids off and disappear, they built the buildings, chopped the wood, hired the teachers, and showed up for every recitation contest. School boards today spend millions trying to achieve the level of community engagement that happened naturally in frontier towns. Makes sense, right? When everyone has skin in the game, everyone cares about the outcome. The teaching methods developed in these schools influenced American education for over a century. That combination of peer tutoring, mixed-age learning and practical application didn't disappear when the frontier closed. Rural schools across America continued using these techniques well into the 1950s and beyond. Some of the most innovative educators today are rediscovering principles that frontier teachers used out of sheer necessity. Let's not forget the role these schools played in creating American democratic values. When children from different backgrounds, social classes and ethnic groups learned together in one room, something powerful happened. Sure, segregation existed in many places, but the ideal of public education for everyone took root in frontier soil. The fights for equal access that began in Wild West towns laid groundwork for civil rights battles that came decades later. The physical legacy is remarkable too. Hundreds of these one-room schoolhouses still stand today, many preserved as museums. But the weird part is how they've become symbols of American education itself. Politicians talk about getting back to basics while pointing to frontier schoolhouses. Educators debate whether modern technology helps or hurts learning by comparing it to the simplicity of slate boards and McGuffey readers. Hollywood certainly played its part in cementing this legacy. Those stern schoolmarms with rulers in hand became cultural icons. The image of the brave teacher taming wild frontier children became part of American mythology. The reality was usually far less dramatic but much more impressive, ordinary people doing extraordinary work under impossible conditions. Modern homeschooling movements often trace their inspiration directly back to frontier schools. The idea that parents and communities can educate children without massive institutional support, that came straight from the Wild West playbook. Today's homeschooling families frequently use the same multi-age individualized approaches that frontier teachers developed by necessity. And the numbers tell an amazing story. By 1900, states that had been uncivilized frontier territory just 50 years earlier boasted literacy rates above 90%. Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, places that had been considered the edge of nowhere, were producing educated citizens at rates that impressed Eastern intellectuals. The architectural influence spread far beyond the West. That classic schoolhouse design, simple, functional, community-centered, became the template for rural schools across America. Even today, when architects design traditional school buildings, they're often echoing design principles first tested in Wild West towns. But perhaps the most lasting impact was philosophical. Frontier schools proved that education could thrive anywhere, under any conditions, if communities truly valued it. They showed that good teaching mattered more than fancy facilities. They demonstrated that mixed-age learning could work better than rigid grade levels. They proved that community involvement made schools stronger. These lessons continue influencing education policy debates today. When people argue about school choice, community control, or standardized testing, they're often invoking principles that were battle-tested in frontier schoolhouses. The idea that local communities should control their schools. That's straight from the Wild West Handbook. The irony is perfect. Schools built in the uncivilized frontier ended up civilizing the entire nation's approach to education. Those rough-and-tumble mining camps and cattle towns created educational traditions that outlasted the frontier itself by more than a century. Wild West schools didn't just teach the 3 R's. They taught America what public education could accomplish when communities truly committed to learning.